There is a place in Australia where the ground swallows sound, where the air changes temperature the moment you descend below the first line of stone, where the walls carry marks that nobody in modern times made and nobody in ancient records explained, where the tunnels run longer than any colonial survey admitted, deeper than any approved engineering plan allowed, and older than any official account was willing to say. And they were sealed, not collapsed, not flooded, not abandoned because they ran dry or became dangerous. Sealed, deliberately, systematically, with materials chosen not to keep people out temporarily, but to keep them out forever, or at least long enough that the questions would stop. But questions have a way of surviving stone. People have been digging in this country for 60,000 years. The oldest continuous civilization on Earth left marks in the landscape that still confuse researchers. Ancient rock art that depicts creatures modern science says shouldn't have existed when humans first arrived. Star maps etched into sandstone that align with celestial events that wouldn't recur for 10,000 years. Trade routes that crisscrossed a continent the size of the continental United States, without wheels, without horses, without any of the infrastructure that supposedly defines civilization. And underneath all of that, underneath the desert and the red clay and the layered sandstone that swallowed so many secrets, there are tunnels. Some are known, some are registered. Some have been studied at a surface level and declared unimportant by the kinds of people who prefer things to be unimportant. But some of them were sealed before anyone could study them properly. And the people who sealed them didn't leave a note explaining why. This is that story. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. There's a peculiar kind of silence that follows a decision to hide something. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of deliberate omission. The kind that shows up in official records as a gap, a page that's been removed, a reference that leads nowhere, a file stamped with a date and a department name and then nothing after that, as if the person who started writing it simply stopped mid-sentence and walked away. Australia has more of those silences than most countries are comfortable admitting. Part of that is geography. The continent is vast in ways that are genuinely hard to comprehend until you've stared at a map and tried to understand that the distance from Sydney to Perth is roughly equivalent to the distance from London to Tehran. Most of that interior is still, in practical terms, inaccessible. Not because roads don't exist, but because the land resists easy cataloguing. It shifts. It floods in places that look like they've never seen water. It dries in places that geological surveys show were once inland seas, and it keeps buried under all of that geological restlessness, things that were put there a long time ago. Some of those things were put there by nature, some of them were not. The earliest European explorers who pushed into the Australian interior did not come back with boring stories. They came back with stories of strange carvings on cliff faces that didn't match any Aboriginal tradition they'd been told about, of passages in the earth that appeared to be shaped by tools rather than by water, of spaces underground that felt, as one 19th century account put it, as though they had been built for a purpose that had nothing to do with shelter. Most of those accounts were filed and forgotten. Some were published in regional newspapers that no longer exist. A handful made it into official correspondence that was eventually archived in ways that made retrieval unlikely rather than impossible. But none of them were followed up on. And that's the first thing that should make you curious. Because when an explorer comes back from unmapped territory and says, "We found something that doesn't make sense," the standard response is to send more people to look at it. That's how science works. That's how government works. That's how human curiosity works. You don't just file it and move on, unless you have a reason to move on. Unless someone, somewhere, decided that the thing the explorer found was not something that should be examined more closely, the question is always why. To understand why, you have to understand the particular history of how Australia was colonized, catalogued, and controlled. And it's a history that has, at multiple critical junctures, involved the systematic suppression of information that complicated the preferred narrative. The preferred narrative was this: Australia was an empty land, or nearly so, inhabited by people who were considered primitive by the colonial standards of the time. People who had left no permanent marks on the landscape, no structures, no monuments, no evidence of organized civilization. Terra nullius, empty earth. A legal fiction that justified dispossession, and a historical fiction that shaped, for over 2 centuries, what researchers were allowed to conclude. The problem with that fiction is that the land itself kept arguing back. The tunnels were part of that argument. The first documented accounts of unusual underground passages in the Australian continent appear in records from the 1840s, during a period of relatively rapid expansion into previously unexplored territory. Surveyors working in what would later become New South Wales and South Australia were tasked with mapping the land for potential agricultural and mining use. It was practical work, unglamorous, and mostly it produced exactly what you'd expect: topographical surveys, soil analyses, water source locations, and the kind of meticulous distance measurements that allowed roads and eventually railways to be planned. But surveying means looking at the ground carefully, and when you look at the ground carefully in parts of Australia, you find things that weren't supposed to be there. One surveyor, whose name appears in colonial records as G. R. Whitmore, filed a report in 1847 describing a series of openings in a sandstone formation near the Darling River that he found, in his words, inconsistent with natural erosion. He noted that the passages appeared to extend horizontally rather than vertically, which would be unusual for water-formed caves. He noted that the walls were, in certain sections, unusually smooth. And he noted that, at several points along the passages he was able to explore, he found what appeared to be carved niches in the stone at regular intervals, as though something had once been placed in them deliberately. He recommended further investigation. No further investigation was recorded. What happened next is a pattern that repeats itself across more than a century of Australian underground discovery. Someone finds something, they report it, the report is received, and then nothing. No follow-up expedition, no commission study, no official response of any kind. Just a gap in the record where a response should be. That gap is its own kind of evidence. But the reports kept coming. Through the 1850s and into the 1860s, as the gold rush brought tens of thousands of new people to the continent and pushed settlement rapidly into previously untouched areas, the accounts multiplied. Miners, by the nature of their work, went underground. They dug in places that had never been dug before, and they found things. What they found, most often, were passages that didn't behave the way natural cave systems behave. Natural caves tend to follow the logic of water. They meander. They open into larger chambers and then narrow again. They change direction in response to the underlying geology. They have floors that are uneven, that bear the marks of water flow, that show the gradual accumulation of sediment over millennia. Some of the passages miners found did none of that. They went straight, or they bent at angles that seemed too deliberate for nature. They had floor levels that, while not perfectly flat, were consistent enough to suggest deliberate leveling. And occasionally they had walls that bore marks that were not the marks of water, not the marks of geological stress, not the marks of any natural process that the miners, most of whom were experienced men who had worked underground before, could identify. The marks were more troubling than the tunnels themselves in some ways, because marks can be dated, marks have style, marks suggest intention, and the intentions these marks seem to suggest did not fit any framework that the colonial administration was prepared to accommodate. In 1863, a group of miners working a claim near Ballarat, in Victoria, broke through into what they described as an existing passage that was clearly not of their making. They followed it for approximately 200 feet before it was blocked by what appeared to be a deliberate fill of stone and packed earth. They attempted to dig through the fill and found it too solid to proceed without proper equipment. They reported their find to the local mining authority. The local mining authority sent an inspector. The inspector filed a report. The report has never been found. What has been found in the archive of the Victorian Mining Department for that year is a note attached to the file where that report should be, in a different hand from the filing clerks, saying simply, "Matter resolved. No further action required. Matter resolved." That phrase, or variations on it, appears in connection with underground discoveries in Australia, with a frequency that, once you start looking for it, becomes difficult to ignore. Not matter investigated and found to be of natural origin, not matter referred to geological survey, just matter resolved. As though resolution was the only relevant outcome, and the nature of that resolution was nobody else's concern. In the 1870s, a geologist named Frederick Chapman, working for the government of South Australia, conducted a survey of cave systems in the Flinders Ranges. The Flinders Ranges are among the oldest exposed rock formations in the world, a place where the geological record stretches back hundreds of millions of years, and where the landscape has been continuously inhabited by Indigenous Australians for at least 40,000 years. Chapman's official report, which was submitted to the Colonial Surveyor General and which has survived in partial form, describes a complex of natural cave systems that he considered geologically significant. But the partial form is the telling detail, because the version of Chapman's report that exists in the archive is missing its final 3 sections. Those 3 sections, referenced by number in the table of contents that survives, are titled Anomalous Formations of Anthropogenic Character, Notes on Sealed Passages, and Recommended Further Action. None of those 3 sections exist in the archive. What does exist is a cover letter, written by the Colonial Surveyor General in response to Chapman's report, which says that the material contained in certain sections of the report has been considered and that the government does not at this time intend to pursue the matters raised therein. The matters raised therein, not the geological findings, not the survey results, the matters. Chapman himself, in a letter written to a colleague in Adelaide in 1879, refers obliquely to his Flinders work as the investigation that cost him his career ambitions. He does not elaborate. He does not explain what happened. He says only that he was advised not to pursue certain lines of inquiry and that he chose, for reasons he preferred not to commit to paper, to take that advice. And then he changed the subject. This is the texture of the early record on Australian underground anomalies. Not a single dramatic revelation, not a single moment of obvious cover-up, but a continuous pattern of stopped investigations, missing sections, redacted findings, and individuals who found things and then fell silent about what they found. The silence has a shape to it, and the shape suggests that the people enforcing the silence knew what they were enforcing it about. Now, before this goes any further into the territory of pure speculation, it's worth being precise about what kind of underground structures are being discussed here. Because Australia does have natural cave systems, and those cave systems are well documented and thoroughly studied. Jenolan Caves in New South Wales, Narracoorte in South Australia, the karst systems of Tasmania, these are real, scientifically understood formations with proper geological explanations and extensive research histories. They're not part of this story. The tunnels this story concerns are different in ways that are specific and, in some cases, measurable. They appear in geological contexts where natural passage formation is not adequately explained by water erosion alone. They have in multiple documented instances walls that show tool marks consistent with deliberate cutting rather than natural stress fractures. They appear in some locations to form systems, meaning they connect to each other in ways that suggest planning rather than random geological accident. And, in a significant number of cases, they were found blocked, not by natural collapse, but by material that was clearly placed there deliberately. That last point is crucial. Natural caves collapse. Natural passages fill with sediment. Natural underground spaces get blocked by geological events. That's ordinary. But an underground passage that is blocked by a wall of carefully fitted stone or by a fill of material that is not native to the surrounding geology, or by a plug of material that chemical analysis later suggested was mixed and prepared rather than naturally deposited, that is not ordinary. That is someone saying, do not go further. The question that has never been satisfactorily answered is who and when and why. The indigenous answer to that question, or at least the version of the indigenous answer that has occasionally surfaced in academic contexts before being regarded as mythological rather than historical, is in some ways the most interesting answer available. Because Aboriginal oral tradition, the oldest continuous oral tradition in human history, does in certain regions preserve references to places underground that were made by beings who are not described as ordinary human ancestors. Places that were used for purposes that the tradition doesn't always articulate clearly, but that were understood to be off-limits to ordinary people. Places that certain initiated individuals were permitted to know about, but not to describe to outsiders. The anthropological tendency has been to interpret these references as spiritual or mythological, rather than physical or historical. To say that when an elder describes a passage under the earth that was made by the Creator ancestors, they are speaking symbolically, not geographically. But that interpretation rests on an assumption that should at least be questioned, which is that the people who preserved these traditions for 60,000 years were not capable of distinguishing between physical places and symbolic ones. That assumption is, to put it plainly, not supported by anything. It is an assumption born of a particular cultural bias that has caused researchers to consistently misread or minimize the factual content of Indigenous oral history. And, in at least some documented cases, oral traditions that were initially dismissed as mythology have turned out to describe real geological events, real species, real historical occurrences. The Murrumbidgee people of New South Wales have a tradition that describes what is translated as the deep road that runs beneath the river country. The deep road is said to have been made in the dreaming, which is not a pastime so much as a foundational layer of reality in Aboriginal cosmology. But the tradition also says that it is real, that it is physical, that it is underground, and that certain people knew how to enter it and use it for travel. That tradition has not been studied seriously in relation to the underground anomalies documented by 19th century surveyors. It probably should be. The Adnyamathanha people of the Flinders Ranges, in South Australia, the very region where Frederick Chapman was advised not to pursue certain lines of inquiry, have traditions that describe underground places of great importance that were sealed against ordinary access by the Yuramuda, the old people, when their time on the land came to an end. Sealed not because the places were dangerous, but because the knowledge required to use them properly no longer existed. That framing is interesting. It suggests that the sealing was protective, not concealing. That the intent was not to hide the existence of these places, but to prevent damage to them by people who wouldn't understand what they were entering. If that framing is accurate, then the question shifts. It's no longer just, who sealed these tunnels? It becomes, what were these tunnels for? That their purpose required specialized knowledge to be exercised safely. And that question opens into something much larger than a regional underground survey. Let's stay with the physical evidence for a moment, because the physical evidence, though fragmentary and in several cases deliberately obscured, is the foundation everything else rests on. There are in Australia a number of sites that have at various times been the subject of unofficial investigation, where the combination of the physical evidence and the administrative response to that evidence forms a pattern that is difficult to explain on innocent grounds. One of the most significant of these is a complex in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney. The Blue Mountains are a deeply eroded sandstone plateau, geologically ancient and riddled with natural cave systems. They're also heavily studied, both because of their geological significance and because they contain some of the most extensive collections of ancient rock art in the world. Aboriginal Australians have been present in the Blue Mountains for at least 22,000 years, and probably longer. In the 1970s, a caver working independently of any official body began a systematic exploration of the cave systems on the western slopes of the range. His name was Daniel Renner, and he was a professional surveyor by training who had become interested in underground geography as a hobby. He had no academic affiliation, no government sponsorship, and no political agenda. He was just a man who liked caves and who was thorough enough to document what he found in careful detail. What he found over about 4 years of exploration included a passage that did not behave like the surrounding natural cave system. It was lower, cut through different rock, oriented differently from the water-formed passages around it, and in certain sections showed wall markings that he photographed and described as appearing to have been made by a cutting tool rather than by natural processes. Renner submitted his survey notes to the New South Wales Department of Lands, which was at that time the appropriate body for registering significant underground discoveries. He heard nothing for 6 months. He followed up. He was told his submission was under review. He followed up again. He was told the matter was being handled by another department. He asked which department. He was told that information was not available to him. In 1979, he received a letter informing him that his survey notes had been reviewed and that the features he had documented were considered to be of natural geological origin. He was thanked for his contribution. He was told that no further investigation was planned. Renner wrote back. He pointed out that the morphology of the passage he had documented was not consistent with natural formation, given the surrounding geology. He asked who had reviewed his notes. He asked what geological assessment had been conducted. He asked whether any specialist had actually visited the site. He received no response to those questions. What he did receive, approximately 3 months later, was a visit from 2 men who identified themselves as employees of a government land management office. They told him that the area he had been surveying was being reclassified under land management legislation in a way that would restrict access. They told him that any future entry to the area without specific authorization would be illegal. And they asked him, politely but very clearly, to return any copies of survey materials he had made that related to the reclassified area. Renner did not return those materials. He kept them. And before he died in 2003, he gave them to a researcher who was working on a study of Blue Mountains cave systems. That researcher, a woman named Anna Kowalski, included a summary of Renner's findings in a privately published monograph on anomalous underground formations in eastern Australia that was printed in an edition of approximately 200 copies in 2006. The monograph is not available in any Australian library. It is not listed in the National Library of Australia catalogue. Copies circulate among people who know to look for them. This script had access to one of those copies. Renner's survey notes describe the passage in enough detail to establish several things. The passage runs approximately southwest to northeast. It is not horizontal. It descends at a consistent angle of approximately 8 degrees over the surveyed section. The walls, where they are clearest, show parallel striations that Renner, a professional surveyor experienced with both natural and man-made underground spaces, found inconsistent with any natural cutting mechanism he was aware of. And at the furthest point of his exploration, where the passage was blocked by a fill of material, he found that the fill was composed of stone that was not native to the surrounding geology. That last detail is significant. Stone that doesn't belong. Material that was brought in from somewhere else to block the passage. You don't carry stone from somewhere else underground to fill a passage unless you intend the fill to be effective, unless you want it to be durable, unless you're doing something more permanent than a temporary closure. Someone carried that stone there. Someone filled that passage with it. And they did not, as far as any official investigation has admitted, leave any record of why. The Blue Mountains case is not unique. It's one of several that share the same basic architecture of evidence and official response. Discovery, report, silence, reclassification, restricted access. Another case, somewhat better known in the small community of researchers who follow these things, involves a property in the Hawkesbury River region, also in New South Wales, where a farmer named Thomas Brennan discovered in 1968 what he described as an entrance to an underground passage on his land while digging post holes for a fence extension. Brennan was not looking for anything unusual. He was a practical man doing practical work on land his family had owned since the 1920s. When he hit what turned out to be the roof of an underground space rather than bedrock, he widened the hole and lowered himself in. What he found, in his own words, recorded in a letter to his brother that his family has preserved, was a passage that went one way and then the other from where he'd come in. Going one way for maybe 40 feet, there was a wall. Not collapsed rock, a wall, smooth, on the inside. Going the other way, he didn't know how far it went, because it was dark, and he hadn't brought a proper light. He went back the next day with a torch. He went further in the other direction and found that the passage eventually opened into a larger space that he described as a chamber, roughly oval, with a ceiling he could just touch when he stood on his toes. The walls of the chamber had markings on them that he could not identify. And on the floor, in several places, there were what appeared to be depressions, as though heavy objects had once rested there. Brennan reported his find to the local council. He then reported it to the State Department of Lands. He then wrote to the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, which existed at that time as a government-funded research body. He received a form letter acknowledging receipt of his correspondence from each of these bodies, nothing more. In 1970, approximately 2 years after he made his discovery, he received notice that his land was being resumed under compulsory acquisition provisions, at a price he felt was well below market value. The official reason given for the acquisition was that the land was required for a water management infrastructure project. No water management infrastructure was ever built on that land. What was built over the following year was a fence. A substantial fence, with concrete posts, at the perimeter of the area where the tunnel entrance was located. And then the entrance itself was, as Brennan put it in a letter he wrote to the Member of Parliament for his region in 1973, concreted over, not filled, not fenced, concreted. The hole that had led into the passage was covered with a concrete slab. The Member of Parliament responded with a letter expressing sympathy and suggesting that infrastructure requirements sometimes unfortunately affected private landowners, and that the compensation process was available if Brennan felt the acquisition price had been inadequate. Thomas Brennan never received anything more than that. He spent the remaining years of his life. He died in 1991, convinced that what he had found on his land was significant, and that someone had decided it should not be investigated. His daughter, who provided his letters to a researcher in the mid-2000s, said that her father rarely talked about it in his later years, but that it had always sat with him, that he'd found something that he believed was real and important, and that the official response had been designed not to investigate it, but to make it go away. To make it go away, that phrase, with its admission of intent, is more revealing than any government document, because it confirms something that should be obvious, but that official silence tends to obscure. These things were not assessed and found to be unimportant. They were determined by someone to be important enough to make go away. And the determination was made before any proper investigation was conducted, which means the people who made that determination already knew what they were dealing with, or thought they did, or had been told what they were dealing with by someone who did. And that chain of knowledge, that inheritance of awareness about what lies beneath certain parts of the Australian landscape, is one of the most interesting threads in this entire story. Because it didn't start with Brennan in 1968. It didn't start with Renner in the 1970s. It didn't start with Frederick Chapman in the 1870s. There is evidence, circumstantial but consistent, that the awareness of what lies underground in certain parts of Australia and the awareness that it should not be widely known goes back much further than that. All the way back, in fact, to the earliest days of European settlement. In 1788, when the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay and established the colony that would eventually become modern Australia, the British government's instructions to the first governor, Arthur Phillip, were primarily concerned with establishing an effective penal colony and managing relationships with the indigenous population, standard colonial instructions for the time. But among the correspondence that accompanied Phillip on his voyage were a series of confidential dispatches that have, over the centuries, received remarkably little scholarly attention. Most historians are aware that such confidential dispatches existed. They are referenced in official correspondence of the period. But the actual content of those dispatches has been a matter of some scholarly frustration, because the relevant archives at the British Public Record Office contain gaps and misfiled materials relating to this period that are, to put it diplomatically, unusually extensive. What can be inferred from the surviving references to those dispatches is that the British colonial government was already, before settlement began, in possession of information about the Australian continent that was not derived from the official exploration accounts of the previous 2 decades. Cook had charted the coastline in 1770. Banks had made botanical observations. The potential of the eastern coast for settlement had been assessed. All of that is well documented. But the confidential dispatches appear to contain something additional, something relating to the interior, something that Phillip and his immediate successors were expected to be aware of, even though the interior of the continent hadn't been extensively mapped by Europeans yet. How would the British government in 1788 have information about the Australian interior that hadn't been produced by official British exploration? That question has several possible answers, and none of them are comfortable. One is that there was unofficial exploration, meaning British or European contact with Australia that predates the official history. There has been persistent scholarly debate about pre-Cook European contact with Australia, and some of the evidence for it is more substantial than its marginal status in mainstream history would suggest. Dutch, Portuguese, and even Chinese contact with the Australian coastline has been argued on the basis of artifact finds, cartographic evidence, and historical records that are genuine even if their interpretation remains disputed. If pre-Cook contact was more extensive than officially acknowledged, it's possible that reports of unusual underground features were brought back to Europe from Australian territory before formal settlement was planned. Another possible answer is that the information came from a different source entirely. Indigenous people had been in contact with traders from the islands to the north of Australia for centuries before European settlement. Macassan fishermen from the island of Sulawesi in what is now Indonesia had regular contact with Aboriginal communities on the northern Australian coast going back at least several hundred years, and possibly much further. Information travelled along those contact networks, and Indigenous knowledge of the Australian landscape, including its underground features, was part of what could theoretically have travelled. A third possibility, the most difficult to assess because it requires the most speculation, is that the information came from the Indigenous people themselves during very early contact. Phillip's instructions apparently included guidance on engaging with the local population in ways that went beyond simple colonial management. Some of that guidance may have concerned the acquisition of geographical and topographical knowledge that Indigenous communities possessed and that the colonial government considered valuable. Whatever the source, the pattern of administrative behaviour in the first century of Australian colonial history makes most sense if the colonial government had prior knowledge of what it was managing. If they had been told, before the first settler stepped off the first fleet, that the continent contained underground features of unusual significance, it would explain why those features were consistently, from the very beginning, treated as matters to be contained rather than investigated. It would explain why the reports keep appearing and the investigations keep not happening. It would explain why the words used in official communications, matters raised therein, matter resolved, not to be pursued, are so consistently evasive about what exactly the matters are. And it would explain something else that becomes apparent when you look at the spatial distribution of these cases on a map. The tunnels and sealed passages that turn up in the historical record are not randomly distributed across the continent. They cluster. They appear in specific regions, at specific geological formations, in places that share certain characteristics in terms of rock type, landscape age, and in most cases, documented indigenous significance. That clustering is not what you'd expect if these were simply natural features that happen to be discovered and then awkwardly mishandled by a bureaucracy unused to dealing with unexpected archaeological finds. Natural features distribute themselves according to geology. They appear where the conditions for their formation exist. And while geological conditions can certainly cluster in specific regions, the clustering of the discovered and sealed passages doesn't align neatly with what we'd expect based on geology alone. It aligns more neatly with something else, something that requires a different map to see. The Aboriginal concept of songlines, the network of pathways across the Australian landscape that encode both navigational information and spiritual knowledge in oral tradition and song, is well documented enough at this point that even mainstream anthropology takes it seriously. The songlines connect specific sacred sites, specific geographical features, specific locations of cultural and spiritual significance, in a network that functions simultaneously as a map, an archive, and a living tradition. When you overlay the known songline networks, or the version of those networks that has been made available to outside researchers, which is necessarily an incomplete version, with the locations of the documented underground anomalies, you get an alignment that is too consistent to be coincidental. The tunnels are on the songlines, or rather, they are at points on the songlines that correspond to what are described in various traditions as places of entry, threshold places, locations where the surface world and what the traditions call the deep world intersect. That framing might sound purely spiritual, and in the context of Aboriginal cosmology, it is partly spiritual. But it's also, in the light of what the physical evidence suggests, potentially geographical. The deep world may not be a metaphor. It may be a description. If the underground passage systems documented across multiple regions of Australia are genuinely connected, if they are part of a larger network rather than isolated local formations, then the songlines that run between surface sacred sites may be, at least in part, tracing the course of that underground network above ground. The elders who maintained the songlines knew where the passages were. They knew how to enter them. They knew what they were for. And when European settlement began disrupting that knowledge, when the people who carried the traditions were being killed and dispersed and denied the freedom of movement that maintaining living knowledge requires, the decision was apparently made by someone to seal the entrances, to protect what was underground from people who had no knowledge of how to use it and no respect for why it existed. That's the Indigenous version of the sealing. And it has a kind of internal logic that the official silence doesn't. The official silence, the colonial and post-colonial administration's consistent refusal to investigate and preference for restriction, makes more sense as a response to the Indigenous version than as an independent policy. If the Indigenous communities were sealing passages to protect them, and if the colonial government was simultaneously aware that something significant lay underground and anxious to prevent it from becoming a subject of public knowledge, both impulses could produce the same observable pattern. Same locked doors, very different reasons. But there's a third party in this story that complicates both of those narratives. A third party that doesn't appear in official records and doesn't appear in Indigenous oral history as usually rendered, but whose presence can be inferred from certain physical evidence that doesn't fit either of the other frameworks. The third party is the question of who made the tunnels in the first place, because the colonial administration didn't make them. They were there before European settlement. The surviving indigenous oral traditions describe them as being made by beings in the dreaming, which is the Aboriginal equivalent of deep time, in which foundational events occurred that shaped the present world. That framing places their creation in a time before the current era of human habitation, or at least at its very beginning. So who made them? And this is where the story opens into its most genuinely uncertain territory, where the evidence thins and the possibilities multiply, where intellectual honesty requires holding multiple competing hypotheses simultaneously without collapsing prematurely into any one of them. One hypothesis is that the passages are natural formations that have been modified by human activity over a very long period of time. Existing cave systems, extended, smoothed, connected by cutting through softer rock sections to create navigable networks. This hypothesis is consistent with known indigenous engineering capability, which is often underestimated, and consistent with a very long time frame. 60,000 years is a long time to work on an underground system. The Aboriginal Australians of the deep past were fully modern humans, with fully modern intelligence, motivation, and engineering instinct. A project undertaken over many generations could produce significant results. A second hypothesis is that the passages represent the remnants of a civilization that preceded current Aboriginal Australian culture, or that developed alongside it in ways that are not adequately captured in the archaeological record as currently understood. There is growing evidence from multiple lines of research that Australian human history is more complicated than previously acknowledged. Genetic evidence suggests multiple migration waves. Archaeological findings at certain sites push back dates of occupation significantly further than the mainstream timeline admitted even 20 years ago. The possibility of a proto-historical period, a time of more complex cultural organization that preceded the period represented by the current archaeological consensus, is not unreasonable. A third hypothesis, and this is the one that will make the largest section of the scientific community most uncomfortable, is that the passages were made by people from somewhere else. Not from outer space, that's not a necessary leap, but from elsewhere on Earth. There is ongoing academic debate, much of it conducted in journals that don't make mainstream news, about the extent of prehistoric maritime contact between Australia and other parts of the world. The Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and even South America have all been proposed at various times as sources of contact with Australia prior to the European period. If those contacts existed, and some evidence suggests they did, then it's possible that the underground passage systems represent, at least in part, the work of people who arrived from elsewhere and who brought engineering traditions that were not indigenous to the continent. That hypothesis is supported by a small but interesting body of physical evidence. Certain of the markings found in the sealed or restricted underground spaces have been compared by researchers who've had access to them with marking systems from other parts of the world, primarily South and Southeast Asia and certain Pacific Island cultures. The comparisons are not conclusive. The researchers who've drawn them have been cautious about overstating the similarities, but they have noted them. And the noting is the start of a line of inquiry that the administrative response has consistently worked to shut down. Why would a government administrative apparatus work to shut down a line of inquiry into ancient underground structures? The obvious answers are the least satisfying: embarrassment about past neglect, jurisdictional complexity in relation to indigenous land rights, resource management concerns, simple, bureaucratic inertia. These things are real and they explain some of the behavior in the record, but they don't explain the pattern, they don't explain the consistency. They don't explain why the same response, silence, restriction, reclassification shows up across different eras, different administrations, different levels of government, in relation to the same basic category of discovery. Something connects those responses, and the most parsimonious explanation for what connects them is that the knowledge of what lies underground and its significance has been maintained at some level of the administrative apparatus continuously since the earliest years of settlement. passed from one set of officials to another, preserved not in public records but in the kinds of institutional awareness that organizations maintain when they have something they've decided, at some founding moment, doesn't belong in public knowledge. That is not a conspiracy theory in the dramatic sense. It doesn't require secret societies or shadow governments or elaborate coordinated deception. It requires only what organizations do naturally when they make a decision. They maintain it, they train their successors, they develop protocols. And the protocol in this case has been, apparently, to ensure that the question of what's underground in certain parts of Australia is never allowed to become a public question. The protocol has held for a long time, but it's showing cracks. The cracks showed up first in the digital age, when documents that had been inaccessible in physical archives became searchable, when images could be shared instantly with researchers on the other side of the world, when the small community of people who knew about the Australian underground anomalies found each other online and began comparing notes systematically for the first time. They showed up when Indigenous communities, increasingly organized and increasingly capable of making their knowledge known on their own terms, began speaking publicly about traditions that had previously been shared only within communities. When elders gave interviews, when community histories were published, when the custodians of certain knowledge decided that the risk of that knowledge being lost was greater than the risk of sharing it with outsiders. And they showed up in the physical landscape itself, which has a way of not cooperating indefinitely with attempts to keep it secret. In 2009, heavy rainfall in the Hawkesbury region, of all places, the region where Thomas Brennan had found his tunnel entrance 40 years earlier, caused a section of farmland to subside. The subsidence revealed the edge of a void beneath the surface. The area was fenced off by local council for safety reasons, ground-penetrating radar surveys were commissioned, and the survey results, which were submitted to the relevant state authority, were subsequently classified under provisions that relate to sensitive archaeological material, classified as sensitive archaeological material, not as a geological safety hazard, which would be the ordinary classification for an unexpected void beneath farmland. Archaeological material, which means that whoever authorized the classification believed the void was of human origin. A void of human origin, in an area that had previously been officially described as containing nothing of archaeological significance, in the vicinity of a tunnel entrance that had been officially concreted over in the early 1970s. The classification has not been revoked. The survey results are not publicly available. The area remains fenced. But the classification itself is a crack in the wall, because it represents an admission, not a public admission, not a formal acknowledgement of anything specific, but an administrative admission that the thing being classified is archaeological, made by human hands, old enough to warrant protection under the kinds of laws that protect ancient human heritage. And if it's old enough to warrant that classification, then it predates European settlement by definition, because European underground construction in Australia is extensively documented and none of it is secret, which means that whatever is underground in that part of New South Wales is pre-European, indigenous to the continent. Part of a period of human activity in Australia that the official record has consistently and apparently deliberately declined to characterize accurately. That's the crack. The administrative language that was meant to contain the information, instead, reveals it, because the choice of what legal category to use tells you something about what the thing being categorized actually is. Archaeological material, pre-European, human origin, sensitive. Those four words, combined with everything else in this story, point in a direction that official silence has spent over a century and a half trying to prevent anyone from pointing in. The direction of a question that is genuinely enormous, and that question is this: what happened in Australia before the period that modern history acknowledges? What was built, or found, or used, underground, by people or possibly by more than one group of people, across a continent that is geologically among the oldest on Earth, across a time period that stretches back further than almost any human civilization, history is prepared to seriously discuss? And who decided that the answer to that question was dangerous enough to justify a policy of systematic concealment that has now persisted for nearly 2 centuries? The answers are not here yet. They may not be anywhere accessible yet, but the question has an address now, a physical address. In sandstone passages and blocked chambers and concreted entrances and classified survey results scattered across a continent that has been hiding something in plain sight. The ground beneath Australia knows what it's been told to forget. But it's a very old ground, it has a very long memory, and memories that long don't stay buried forever. Not all of the evidence for Australia's sealed underground systems comes from colonial documents and suppressed surveys. Some of it is written in stone, and some of that stone has been photographed, measured, and documented by researchers who were allowed brief access before the access was revoked. In 1975, a team from the Australian Institute of Archaeology, a private organisation not affiliated with government, conducted a survey of rock art in the Central Australian region as part of a broader project on pre-contact Indigenous culture. The team was led by a man named Graham Lockwood, who had spent the preceding decade documenting rock art sites across the continent, and who had developed, in that time, a sophisticated understanding of the symbolic systems used across different cultural regions. Lockwood's team found, in a location they describe in their published report only as a sandstone formation in the central region, a rock art panel of unusual character. It was unusual because the symbols on it were not consistent with the regional stylistic tradition they'd been expecting. Central Australian rock art has a well-documented set of conventions, a visual language that reflects specific cultural traditions and that is recognizable to researchers familiar with the material. The panel Lockwood's team found didn't speak that language. Instead, it used a system of marks that Lockwood, in his published account, described as resembling certain non-Australian mark-making systems he had encountered in his reading of comparative archaeology. He was careful not to overstate the similarity. He noted that the marks could have developed independently in Australia without any external influence, but he documented them thoroughly, and he argued in his report that they warranted further study. His report was published in the Institute's own journal in 1976. It was not widely circulated outside specialist circles, but it was read, apparently, by the right or wrong people. Because, in 1977, Lockwood was contacted by a representative of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and told that the site he had documented was being listed under newly enacted heritage protection legislation and that future access would require departmental approval. Departmental approval for a site he'd already documented, a site that had been accessible when he visited it. He applied for approval to revisit the site. He was told the application was under consideration. He followed up at regular intervals over the next several years. He was always told the application was under consideration. He never received a decision. Not a yes, not a no, just perpetual consideration. Lockwood died in 1989. His original field notes and photographs from the 1,975 survey were donated to a university library after his death. Several of the photographs from the Central Region Survey have since been examined by researchers in comparative symbol systems, and the assessments range from inconclusive to deeply interesting. The deeply interesting assessments come from researchers who have compared the marks with Indus Valley script, with certain pre-Columbian North American marking systems, and with mark-making traditions from Sulawesi in Indonesia. None of those comparisons are definitive. None of them have been published in mainstream peer-reviewed journals. The researchers who've made them work in the margins of their fields, in the places where the interesting questions lie, precisely because they're too uncomfortable for the center. But the comparisons exist, and their existence is a thread. A thread that connects Australia not to an isolated mystery, but to a much larger question about the history of human movement and exchange across the ancient world. Because here's the thing about sealed tunnels in Australia. They're not entirely without parallels elsewhere. Sealed underground systems of contested origin appear in other parts of the world. Some are well known, extensively documented, argued about in proper academic journals. The underground city of Derinkuyu in Cappadocia, Turkey, the ancient tunnel system beneath Jerusalem that connects sites of religious significance, the extensive underground networks in Malta that include chambers predating the above-ground megalithic temples, the underground passages beneath Chavin de Huantar in Peru, which served religious and administrative functions in a culture that influenced much of South America. These underground systems are not considered controversial in their existence. They're argued about in terms of age, purpose, and cultural context, but their existence is accepted. They're real, and people can go look at them. What makes the Australian cases different is the refusal to acknowledge that the Australian examples belong in the same category. The international examples are treated as historical and archaeological. The Australian examples are treated as either natural formations or administrative matters, never as ancient human infrastructure that might have as much to tell us about the deep past as Derinkuyu or Chavin de Huantar. That distinction in treatment is itself a form of evidence, because it implies that someone, somewhere, has assessed the Australian material and concluded that placing it in the same category as those internationally known examples would have implications that are undesirable. What implications? If tunnels beneath the Australian landscape represent evidence of organised human engineering going back further than the currently accepted record of complex human activity in the region, that changes the history. Not just the history of Australia, but the history of human civilization more broadly. It suggests that the development of organised, intentional, infrastructural activity in human communities extends back further and across wider geographies than the mainstream narrative has acknowledged. That's a big revision. And big revisions are uncomfortable. They require existing scholarship to be re-examined. They require funding priorities to change. They require textbooks to be rewritten. They require the people who built careers on the existing framework to publicly acknowledge that the framework was incomplete. None of that is unusual in science. Science revises itself constantly. The history of every field is a history of frameworks overturned by evidence. That's the whole point. But the revision that Australian underground evidence would require is not just professionally inconvenient, it's politically sensitive, in a way that most scientific revisions are not, because it relates directly to the history of Aboriginal Australians, to the question of what that history actually contains, and to the still unresolved question of how the relationship between that history and the colonial project that displaced it should be understood and addressed. If the underground systems are as old and as sophisticated as the physical evidence suggests, then Aboriginal Australian civilization, broadly understood, produced infrastructure that rivals anything in the ancient world. That has implications for how Aboriginal culture has been characterized historically and in the present. It has implications for land rights. It has implications for the ongoing legal and political negotiations about Indigenous sovereignty. It changes the moral weight of what was lost during colonization. And those implications are of interest not just to academic researchers, but to governments, legal systems, and political processes that are still working through the consequences of that history, which might explain why the administrative response to underground discoveries in Australia has not simply been scientific incompetence. It might also have been, at least in part, a form of political management, a decision that the can, as it were, should be kept closed because opening it would release more than archaeological surprises. That is a disturbing possibility. More disturbing than a straightforward cover-up of a single interesting discovery. because it suggests that the suppression has been ongoing not because officials believed the material was insignificant, but because they understood its significance very well and found that significance inconvenient. It suggests that what lies beneath Australia has been known at some level of the apparatus for a long time, and that the decision to keep it from becoming public knowledge has been made not once but repeatedly in different eras by different people who either were told what their predecessors knew or who independently arrived at the same assessment. That this particular set of facts is not one that the public interest is served by making widely available. That is a remarkable decision if it was made, and the pattern of evidence, the consistent pattern that runs from the 1840s to the 2009 subsidence, suggests that something like it was made. But decisions made by people can be unmade. Information suppressed by administrative action can survive administratively. In the classified file that someone eventually finds, in the private letter that a family preserves, in the photograph that a researcher donates to a university library before anyone thinks to prevent it. And information that is no longer suppressed has a way of building. One document connects to another. One photograph matches a symbol from another continent. One oral tradition aligns with a physical location. One gap in the archive tells you what was supposed to be there. And then you start to see not individual anomalies, but a pattern. A pattern that is the shape of something that was deliberately hidden, but that has too many edges, too many corners, too many places where it protrudes into the observable world to stay hidden indefinitely. The sealed tunnels of Australia are one edge of that shape. Let's talk about what's on the other side of the world for a moment, because this story is not only Australian. It connects through threads that are faint but real, to questions being asked about underground structures in other parts of the world, and specifically about a category of underground discovery that has received significant attention in the Americas. Because there are sealed tunnels in the Americas too. And some of the most interesting ones are in places that predate the civilizations that are supposed to have built them. In the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, beneath the forests and the cenotes, the sinkholes that connect to underground rivers, there are passage systems that were known to the Maya and that the Maya considered sacred. The Maya built their major ceremonial centers in locations that were chosen, at least in part, because of what lay beneath them. The underground waterways that the cenotes provided access to were religious sites, places where communication with the underworld, the realm of the dead, and the supernatural was believed to be possible. But beneath the Maya structures, and predating them, there are passage systems that are not Maya. Not in style, not in the methods by which they were cut, not in the symbols that appear on their walls. They're older. How much older is contested, but they're older. Archaeological work in the Yucatan over the past 3 decades has established that the Maya were building on top of an earlier cultural layer that is not fully characterized. The earlier layer includes stone constructions, underground chambers, and passage systems that don't match Maya engineering or Maya symbolic conventions. The prevailing interpretation is that these represent an earlier phase of the same cultural tradition, predecessors of the Maya who used the same landscape differently. But that interpretation is being challenged by researchers who find the differences between the two layers more significant than the similarities, who point out that certain techniques evident in the older material are not consistent with what the cultural precursors of the Maya are known to have done, who note that some of the symbols in the older underground spaces resemble symbols from cultures geographically distant enough that independent development is the least economical explanation. These researchers are not in the mainstream of Mesoamerican archaeology. They work at the margins. They publish in journals that polite academic society doesn't always take seriously. They're accused of motivated reasoning, of seeing patterns that confirm pre-existing beliefs about ancient civilizations and pre-Columbian contact. Some of those accusations are fair. Some of the people making claims about ancient Mesoamerican underground structures are working from incomplete evidence toward conclusions that are more dramatic than the evidence supports. But not all of them. And the existence of bad arguments for a proposition doesn't make the proposition false. It just means you have to be careful about which arguments you use to evaluate it. The connection between the Mesoamerican underground mysteries and the Australian ones is not a direct physical connection. Nobody is arguing that there's a tunnel from Australia to Mexico. The connection is of a different kind. It's a connection of pattern, the same administrative response in different countries and different eras, the same combination of physical evidence and official silence, the same gap between what the physical material suggests and what official sources are prepared to say about it, the same clustering of discoveries near sites of known indigenous significance, the same tradition of oral history that locates the underground spaces in a category of deep time and sacred use. And in some cases, more unsettlingly, the same categories of marks on the walls. In 2014, a team of researchers affiliated with a small independent research institute in New Mexico, who had been studying underground chambers in the American Southwest, published a preliminary paper in which they noted parallels between marking systems in certain chambers in the Four Corners region of the American West and marks documented in underground spaces in northern Australia. They were explicit that they were not claiming a direct cultural connection. They were noting the similarity because they thought it warranted investigation. They called for collaborative research between Australasian and North American researchers to examine the question systematically. No collaborative research program was established. The paper received limited attention. The researchers continued their work independently. But the paper exists, and the photographs it reproduces exist, and the similarity it describes, while not dramatic enough to make headlines, is specific enough to be interesting to anyone who looks at the images carefully. Similar marks, in similar contexts, in underground spaces on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean, in places where the mainstream story says there was no connection. That's a genuinely interesting observation. Not proof of anything, but interesting. The kind of interesting that, in normal scientific practice, generates funded research programs and collaborative expeditions and doctoral dissertations and eventually conclusions. Unless someone decides the conclusions aren't wanted. In the Four Corners region specifically, there is a long history of underground discovery that shares certain features with the Australian material. The American Southwest is riddled with ancient underground spaces, some natural, many modified, some apparently constructed. The ancestral Puebloans, the civilization known historically as the Anasazi, were sophisticated engineers who built extensive underground ceremonial spaces called kivas, as well as storage chambers, escape tunnels, and in some locations, passage systems connecting settlements. Their underground engineering is well documented and extensively studied. But beneath the ancestral Puebloan material, as in Mesoamerica, there is an older layer, a layer that the ancestral Puebloans themselves apparently built on top of. And that older layer contains materials and construction techniques that don't straightforwardly match what is known about the ancestral Puebloan tradition or its acknowledged precursors. In Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, the center of the most advanced phase of ancestral Puebloan culture, the great houses, the massive multi-story buildings that represent the civilization's architectural peak, are positioned in a way that aligns with astronomical events and with a network of roads that radiate outward from the canyon across hundreds of miles. The roads have been extensively studied. They're real, they're surveyed, they're documented. But the roads sometimes disappear underground. They lead to points in the landscape where they simply stop at ground level, with the geological context suggesting that they continue below ground rather than that they simply end. Where they go underground hasn't been adequately investigated. Not because the archaeology of Chaco Canyon is underfunded, it isn't, but because the underground continuations of the road system are in locations that have, at various times and for various stated reasons, been placed off-limits to excavation. Off-limits to excavation, in an archaeological site that is otherwise extensively excavated and studied. The reasons given have varied. sensitivity to Pueblo religious traditions, which is genuinely important and must be considered in archaeological work in this region. Concerns about site preservation, resource limitations, jurisdictional issues between federal and tribal management. All of these are real considerations. None of them fully explains why, in a site that has been studied by professional archaeologists for over a century, certain specific locations consistently remain unexcavated, unless those locations were assessed at some point by someone and found to contain something that shifted them from the category of archaeological resources to be studied to the category of things that require a different kind of management. That shift in category is the signature move. It's the same move in Australia, in Mexico, in the American Southwest. The same administrative gesture that removes an anomalous underground space from the domain of normal scientific inquiry and places it in a domain of restricted access, sensitive management, perpetual review. The move says, "We know this is here. We've decided you don't need to know what it is." At Chaco Canyon, the move has been made quietly enough that most of the researchers who work there don't think about it. They work within the boundaries that have been set, and they do excellent work within those boundaries. The archaeology of Chaco Canyon is real and valuable, and has told us important things about ancestral Puebloan culture. But the question of what's beneath the surface at certain specific locations remains officially unasked, and the roads that lead underground haven't been followed. In Arizona, in the area around the Verde Valley, there are historical accounts of underground chambers discovered by early settlers and miners that share features with the Australian material. Chambers with dressed stone walls, smooth floors, and marks that didn't match any construction tradition the settlers were familiar with. Chambers that were, in several documented cases, reported to the local authorities, received with what appears to be disproportionate official interest, and subsequently sealed or made inaccessible. The Verde Valley accounts are less well documented than the Australian material because the region has a different documentary history. The American Southwest was colonized later and documented less systematically in its early period than Eastern Australia. But the pattern of the accounts, where it can be reconstructed, is familiar. Find something. Report it. Get an odd response, lose access, end of story. In Utah, in the Canyon Country, there is a tradition among certain indigenous communities of the region describing underground passages connecting sacred sites across the landscape. The passages are described in terms that, like the Australian traditions, suggest both physical reality and sacred significance. They are places of power, places of transition, places where ordinary people are not supposed to go without proper preparation. The Hopi tradition, which is among the most thoroughly documented of the Southwest's indigenous traditions, includes references to a previous world beneath the current one, a world that was inhabited before this one and that was accessed through places in the earth that are now sealed. The Hopi emergence story, the account of how the Hopi people came to the current world from the world below, is usually treated as a mythological narrative. But the Hopi themselves distinguish between metaphorical narratives and narratives that describe actual physical events that happened in historical time. The emergent story, by Hopi understanding, is not metaphor. It is history. It describes something that actually happened in actual physical locations, which can be identified. And some of the identified locations are underground places. Places that are sealed, places to which access is not generally permitted. When Hopi elders have spoken publicly about these places, they have been careful in their language. They have distinguished between what is their knowledge to share and what is not. But they have confirmed in general terms that the underground places are real, that they are sealed, and that the sealing was deliberate. The reason given, in the most general terms available to an outsider, is protection. The places are sealed to protect both the places and the people who might otherwise enter them without knowing what they were entering. That framing, protection rather than concealment, appears in multiple traditions in multiple parts of the world. In Australia, in the American Southwest, in parts of Mesoamerica, It suggests that the people closest to these places, the people whose traditions maintain knowledge of them, had a different understanding of the ceiling than the colonial administrations that subsequently restricted them. For the indigenous communities, the ceiling was an act of custodianship. For the administrations, the restriction was an act of management. Both responses involve the same physical reality, underground spaces that are not accessible. But the reasons are different enough that they're almost not describing the same thing. And yet, they produce the same result, which is, you can't go down there. The question underneath all of the questions in this story, the one that sits in the dark at the bottom of every sealed shaft and blocked passage, is this. What are these spaces? Not just what they were made by, or when, or by whom, though those are also important questions, but what were they for? What function did they serve? What was the knowledge that surrounded their use, the knowledge that the elders kept and that certain initiated individuals carried, the knowledge that was understood to be necessary for safe entry? The physical evidence, fragmentary as it is, offers some hints. The chambers in the documented Australian cases tend to have certain features in common. Beyond the sealed entrances and the non-native fill material, the chambers themselves tend to be consistent in their dimensions in ways that suggest they were sized for a specific purpose. Not random, not the ad hoc dimensions of spaces that were expanded as needed, but chambers that were shaped to particular specifications. The niches in the walls, described in multiple independent accounts, suggest storage. The depressions in the floors suggest that objects of specific sizes and weights rested in those places. The passages connecting chambers suggest movement between spaces, access from one to another. None of that is unusual in the context of what underground spaces are typically used for in human history. Storage, shelter, ceremonial use, navigation through difficult terrain, mines. But the combination of features, together with the locations, the geological context, and the scale of the systems where it can be inferred, suggests something more organized than improvised use, something more intentional than seasonal shelter, something more permanent than temporary storage. Some researchers who've worked in this area, working without official support and often without institutional affiliation, have suggested that the underground systems in Australia and their apparent counterparts in other parts of the world represent something that doesn't have a good category in current archaeological thinking. They suggest these might be infrastructure, not for one culture's use, but for a kind of activity that crossed cultural boundaries. Transit, exchange, the movement of people, goods, or knowledge through channels that were designed to be used by those who knew about them and invisible to those who didn't. The idea of an ancient underground exchange network connecting sites of indigenous significance sounds almost impossible when stated bluntly. It sounds like the kind of claim that belongs in speculative fiction rather than in a documentary investigation of physical evidence. And it may well be that, when the evidence is fully examined, the more mundane explanations prove sufficient. But the physical evidence doesn't make it impossible. It makes it one of the hypotheses that the evidence is consistent with. And in the absence of the investigation that should have been conducted when the evidence was first found, it remains one of the hypotheses on the table. The sealed tunnels are sealed against investigation as much as against entry. You can't go down there. You can't study what's down there. You can't assess whether the dramatic hypotheses or the mundane ones are better supported by the physical material, which means that the ceiling is maintaining an uncertainty that would otherwise be resolvable. An uncertainty about the nature of the human past that is, in its unresolved state, more convenient for some interests than a resolution would be. And that convenience, that preservation of uncertainty through suppression of investigation, is perhaps the most telling thing in this entire story. Because uncertainty that is deliberately maintained is not the same as genuine ignorance. Genuine ignorance is the state of not knowing something. Deliberately maintained uncertainty is the state of knowing enough to decide that more knowledge is unwanted. And the pattern of the record, the pattern that runs from G.R. Whitmore's 1847 report to the 2009 classified survey, is not the pattern of ignorance. It's the pattern of managed uncertainty, of people who knew something and decided that what they knew should not be added to or shared. That's the shape of what lies beneath Australia's official record. Not a hole where knowledge should be, but a surface laid carefully over knowledge that was already there. The surface is the stone fill in the tunnel, the concrete slab over Brennan's shaft, the reclassified archive, the report with the missing final 3 sections. And what's beneath the surface is still waiting. As is often the case with well-maintained secrets, the cracks appear not at the most sensitive point, but at the edges. At the places where the management of information intersects with the ordinary processes of the world, where a flood undermines a filled tunnel, where a surveyor's notes survive because he kept his own copies, where an elder decides that a tradition that risks being lost is a tradition that should be shared with whoever will preserve it. In the 1990s, a number of factors combined to make the Australian underground question somewhat less manageable than it had been in previous decades. The internet, still in its early phase, created channels of communication between researchers who had previously been isolated. The political and legal gains of the Aboriginal land rights movement created new contexts in which Indigenous knowledge was more likely to be publicly stated and documented. And a series of geological events, flooding, drought, subsidence, exposed underground spaces that had been sealed and produced new evidence that required administrative response. One of the most significant of these exposures occurred in 1994 in the Northern Territory, following heavy monsoon flooding that affected an area of low-lying country near a known Aboriginal sacred site. The flooding undermined a section of ground and exposed what was subsequently described in the state authorities' emergency response documents, which are accessible because they went through an emergency management channel rather than the usual heritage management channel, as a series of interconnected voids of apparent anthropogenic origin. Apparent anthropogenic origin, official language for "it looks like someone made this." The emergency management response involves stabilization of the surface above the voids and emergency documentation of the exposed material, which included photographs that were incorporated into the official incident report. The incident report is technically a public document, accessible under Freedom of Information, which is why we know it exists. The photographs are not part of what's accessible under Freedom of Information. They have been withheld on the basis of cultural sensitivity provisions. But the written descriptions in the incident report are available, and they describe, in careful neutral emergency management language, voids with walls that showed signs of deliberate shaping, passage dimensions consistent with human use, and materials at several points that appeared to be deliberately placed fill rather than natural sediment accumulation. Deliberately placed fill, again, in a location that had never previously been on any record as an archaeological site, in a void that was only exposed because a flood undermined the ground surface that had, apparently for a very long time, concealed it. How long a very long time was, the incident report does not assess. That would require archaeological work that, as far as any public record indicates, was not subsequently commissioned. What was commissioned, according to follow-up documents that appear in the same administrative chain, was a site assessment under heritage legislation, the results of which were provided to the relevant cultural authority, which in this case meant the body responsible for managing Northern Territory Aboriginal sacred sites, and which are consequently not publicly available under cultural heritage protection provisions. So the photographs are withheld as culturally sensitive. The site assessment results are not publicly available as sacred site management material. The incident report describes something clearly significant in deliberately neutral language, and the site is, as of the last available public record, subject to management protocols that don't allow further investigation. Management protocols that don't allow further investigation. In a location that has just been shown to contain underground spaces of human origin that weren't in any existing record, the management protocol is doing the same work in 1994 that the letter saying matter resolved was doing in 1863. The language has changed. The mechanism has changed. The result is the same. In recent years, from approximately 2010 onward, the question of what lies underground in certain parts of Australia has attracted a different kind of attention than it received in earlier decades. Partly this is the internet. Partly it's the increased public interest in stories about ancient history that don't fit conventional frameworks. Partly it's the increased willingness of Indigenous communities to speak publicly about knowledge that had previously been more closely held. But partly it's something more specific to the current moment, which is the intersection of the underground question with the land rights question in a way that makes the political stakes of the whole matter more visible. Because the land rights movement in Australia has, since the early 1990s and the landmark Mabo decision that legally abolished the doctrine of terra nullius, been working through the implications of recognizing that Aboriginal Australians had, prior to colonisation, legal claims to land that were never extinguished. The Mabo decision and the Native Title Act that followed it created mechanisms for Indigenous communities to claim recognition of their rights to specific pieces of land based on continuous connection to those lands. Continuous connection. That phrase is the legal key, and it is directly relevant to the underground question, because if there are underground spaces of Indigenous origin beneath land that was seized under the fiction of terra nullius, those spaces represent evidence of exactly the kind of continuous and organized presence on the land that the terra nullius doctrine was designed to deny. Their existence, properly documented and studied, would not only change the historical record, it would potentially have implications for the ongoing process of native title claims. And that intersection between archaeology and law is one in which very large interests are at stake. Not just the historical interests of understanding the human past, but the current economic and political interests that are affected by where the lines of native title are drawn. Mining interests, pastoral interests, infrastructure interests, the interests of the entities that hold rights to land in areas where underground spaces might exist and might, if properly documented, become the basis for Indigenous land rights claims. Those interests are substantial. And the history of Australian politics shows that those interests have, at various points, been capable of significant influence over government decision-making. If the underground evidence has been suppressed, partly because of its potential legal implications for land rights, then the suppression is not simply a matter of bureaucratic discomfort with anomalous historical data. It's a matter of money, of property, of the economic relationships built on the assumption that the land beneath which these spaces exist is not subject to any competing claim. And that makes the suppression both more explicable and more troubling, because it gives it a motive that goes beyond academic convenience. A motive rooted in the kinds of interests that have historically been willing to do a great deal to protect themselves. The original sealing, the sealing done by Aboriginal custodians to protect underground spaces from people who wouldn't understand them, was an act of care. The subsequent restriction, the administrative management of information about those spaces, may have become an act of protection for something entirely different. The original custodians were protecting the places. The subsequent management was protecting the interests of people who'd rather the places didn't exist. Two kinds of protection. Same locked doors. But the locked doors don't change what's behind them. And what's behind them, in the most general terms that the available evidence supports, is something like this. An ancient network of underground spaces, constructed or significantly modified by human hands, distributed across significant portions of the Australian continent in patterns that align with traditional Indigenous land knowledge of an age that places their origin well before the period that conventional history has characterized as the beginning of organized human activity in Australia. An underground heritage that is older than the official story, more sophisticated than the official story allows, and more significant in its implications for how we understand the human past than any administrative response to date has been willing to acknowledge. That's the shape of the thing. Not a single dramatic secret, not a single buried treasure chamber, not aliens, not fiction, but a genuine gap between what the physical record suggests and what the official record acknowledges, maintained for nearly 2 centuries by a consistent policy of managed uncertainty that has served the interests of the people doing the managing rather than the interests of understanding what was found. The gap is still there. The tunnels are still sealed, the survey results are still classified, the archive sections are still missing. And the land itself, old as it is, patient as it is, keeps shifting, keeps subsiding, keeps letting the rain find the edges of what was put there a very long time ago. The ground beneath Australia has a longer memory than the institutions built on its surface. And eventually, as with all memories that are long enough and buried deep enough, it will find a way to speak. Not all stories that deal with sealed underground spaces in Australia involve government archives and colonial records. Some of them involve people. Ordinary people who went somewhere, found something, and were changed by it. People whose experiences don't fit neatly into the framework of documented historical investigation, but who add something to the texture of the story that the documents alone don't provide. These accounts have to be handled carefully. Personal testimony is not the same as physical evidence. People misremember, people embellish. People interpret their experiences through frameworks that may not correspond to what they actually encountered. And in the specific context of mysteries about ancient underground structures, there is a population of people whose desire to have had a significant experience predisposes them to interpret ambiguous encounters as more significant than they are. All of that has to be accounted for, and when you account for it, many of the personal accounts in this territory become much less interesting. But some of them don't. Some of them remain interesting even when you've applied every reasonable skeptical filter available. Because they come from people who weren't looking for anything unusual, who have nothing to gain from the account, who describe their experience in terms that are specific rather than vague, and who corroborate details that appear in the documented record without having had access to that record. Margaret Stanhope was a retired schoolteacher from South Australia who died in 2017 at the age of 84. She had, in her late 60s, taken up bushwalking as a retirement activity, and she spent several years walking sections of the Flinders Ranges as part of organised walking groups. In 2001, on a solo walk in a section of the ranges she knew well, she entered a narrow gorge she had not previously explored and found what she described as a passage in the rock face that didn't look like a natural cave entrance. She went in far enough to establish that the passage went further than she could see with the daylight available. She noted that the walls, where she could see them, were smoother than the surrounding rock. She noted that the air inside was cooler than the air outside, in a way that didn't change as she went further in, which she found unusual. And she noted, approximately 20 feet in, a series of marks on the right-hand wall that she could not identify, but that she remembered clearly enough to draw from memory later. She came out. She continued her walk. She told no one for several years. When she eventually told the story to a granddaughter who was studying archaeology at university, the granddaughter encouraged her to document it. The grandmother's account was recorded in 2011 as a written statement accompanied by her drawing of the wall marks she had observed. The granddaughter, whose research interests were in pre-contact Indigenous culture, recognized some similarity between the marks her grandmother had drawn and marks documented in published research on rock art from a different region. She wrote to the researcher who had published the relevant paper. The The researcher wrote back with cautious interest and asked for more details. The correspondence continued for some time. The researcher eventually asked if it might be possible to visit the site. The grandmother agreed to try to identify the location, again from memory. A visit was planned. 3 weeks before the planned visit, the grandmother received a letter from the local branch of the state's Park and Wildlife Service, informing her that the gorge she had described was being incorporated into an expanded management zone under heritage legislation, and that access to the gorge would in future require a permit. She had mentioned the gorge's name, a geographical name, in her account to the researcher, who had included it in the correspondence. The timing of the restriction, 3 weeks before a planned research visit, was noted by both women. The visit did not proceed. The researcher applied for a permit through proper channels. The application was acknowledged. A decision was never received. Margaret Stanhope's drawing of the wall marks she described is in her family's possession. Her granddaughter, who is now a practicing archaeologist, has declined to make it publicly available while she is employed in her current position, for reasons she has not elaborated on beyond saying that it wouldn't be appropriate at this time. That phrase, "it wouldn't be appropriate at this time," is the contemporary equivalent of the Victorian mining inspector's matter resolved. The language is different. The effect is the same. Then there's the account of a man called David Nearford, a semi-retired mining engineer who spent the last years of his career as a consultant to small exploration companies looking for mineral deposits in the Northern Territory and Western Australia. Nearford was not mystically inclined. His professional life had been defined by the hard-nosed analysis of geological data and the practical engineering challenges of underground work. He was, by his own description, exactly the kind of person who doesn't make up stories about strange underground experiences. In 2004, a company he was consulting for was conducting exploratory drilling in a region of the Northern Territory that had been assessed as potentially containing economic quantities of certain minerals. The drilling program was routine. Nearford was on site as a technical advisor. On a day in mid-August, one of the drill rigs broke through into a void at a depth of approximately 45 meters. This is not unusual in mining work. Underground voids are a hazard that drilling programs anticipate and manage. The standard response is to log the void, assess its extent where possible, and adjust the drilling program accordingly. What was unusual was what the drill crew found when they lowered a camera into the void. The camera feed, which Nearford watched on the monitor in the site office, showed a space that was large enough for the camera to swing in and not immediately hit a wall. The floor of the void, visible below the camera, showed what appeared to be an even, worked surface. And on one wall that came into frame as the camera rotated, there were marks. Nearford described watching the camera feed and feeling something he had not expected to feel in 30 years of professional underground work. He described it as the feeling you get when something that should be explained by the ordinary framework of your experience fails to be explained by that framework. He described the marks as being too regular to be natural, and the surface of the floor as being too even to be natural. He reported the find to the company. The company reported it to the relevant regulatory authority. The regulatory authority sent a representative within 48 hours, which Nearford noted was unusually fast for a regulatory response in that region. The representative spent several hours on site. She reviewed the camera footage. She collected the logging data. She took detailed notes. And before she left, she informed the company that the drilling program was being suspended pending an assessment of the void under heritage legislation. The assessment, again, produced no publicly available conclusions. The drilling program did not resume. The company lost its exploration license in that area 2 years later under circumstances that Nearford, in the account he gave to a researcher he contacted in 2012, described as legally convenient rather than genuinely justified. The camera footage, which Nearford had copied onto a personal storage device before the regulatory representative arrived, showed approximately 90 seconds of footage from the void. Nearford shared still images from that footage with the researcher. The researcher has described the images as showing features inconsistent with natural void formation in the relevant geological context, but has not published them, citing concerns about the legal position of anyone who receives material that was obtained in ways that might be considered unauthorized. Nearford himself died in 2016. The researcher who spoke with him has not published the account. It exists in unpublished form. The pattern, again, the pattern of evidence approaching the light and then being, by one mechanism or another, redirected away from it. These personal accounts are not proof. They're not definitive. They're fragments, but they're consistent fragments. They fit into the larger picture in ways that are difficult to explain if the larger picture is simply an elaborate misunderstanding. And in aggregate, they add something the documented record can't quite provide, which is the sense of physical experience. The experience of actually being in one of these spaces, of seeing something that your professional training and your life experience tell you doesn't fit, of having a direct encounter with an anomaly that the official framework insists doesn't exist. Those who've had that experience, or who believe they've had it, describe consistently a particular quality of the encounter. Not supernatural, not dramatic, just unmistakably out of place. The wrong smoothness, the wrong regularity, the marks that human hands make that nature doesn't, the knowledge in the body that you are in a space that a person made, and that the person who made it knew what they were doing. That knowledge doesn't prove anything about the history or the age or the purpose of the space, but it contributes to the accumulation of testimony that tells you the spaces are there, that they're significant enough to generate the kind of official response that has repeatedly surrounded them, and that the people who have encountered them have not, in the main, been confused about what they were encountering. They weren't in natural caves, they weren't in ordinary mines, they weren't in known archaeological sites, they were in something else. Something that the official framework has consistently declined to characterize. And the consistent refusal to characterize is itself the answer to the question this story opened with. Why were Australia's oldest tunnels sealed on purpose, and why won't anyone say why? Because the why is embedded in the what. Understanding why requires understanding what. And understanding what would require an investigation that has consistently, deliberately, and apparently purposefully been prevented. The sealing of the tunnels is the first sealed thing. The sealing of the investigation is the second. And the second sealing, more than the first, is what sustains the mystery. Because the first sealing, whatever its original purpose, was made by people who knew what they were protecting and why. The second sealing, the administrative sealing, is made by people who have decided that the answer to the question is more dangerous than the question itself. Which means, somewhere, someone knows the answer. Somewhere in a classified survey result. In a photograph held back from a Freedom of Information request. In a conversation between people who are authorized to know and who have decided that that authorization does not extend to the general public. Somewhere, the answer exists. Already found. Already assessed. Already known to someone. And the known answer is, apparently, interesting enough to be worth keeping from everyone else. That's the final piece of the pattern. The last note in the long, consistent 2 centuries long administrative melody of, we know, you don't need to. But the question, once asked seriously, doesn't stop being asked. It echoes. It survives the people who tried to suppress it. It shows up in the notes of a surveyor who filed his own copies. In the letters of a farmer who was angry enough to write to his MP, in the photographs of a caver who kept what he was asked to return, in the oral traditions of communities who preserved knowledge across 60,000 years in exactly the form that makes it hardest to officially suppress, the knowledge is underground, in both senses. And underground things have a way of surfacing, not all at once, not dramatically, not in the way that the imagination, fed on dramatic narratives, expects. They surface slowly, in the gap between what a document says and what it redacted, in the phrase that accidentally admits what it was trying to conceal, in the subsiding earth that reveals what was beneath it, in the story that a grandmother tells a granddaughter who happens to know enough to understand what it means. The sealed tunnels of Australia are still sealed. The classified surveys are still classified. The stories are still in the margins, in the privately published monographs that aren't in any library, in the unpublished accounts of researchers who found themselves on the wrong side of a permission denied. But they're there. The structure is there. The shape is there. The cumulative weight of 2 centuries of managed mystery is there, and it points somewhere. Beneath the oldest continent, in the oldest rock, in spaces that human hands made for purposes that human hands stopped maintaining somewhere in the long passage between the deep past and now. Waiting, as very old things do, with a patience that outlasts any administrative decision about what the public needs to know. The ground has been waiting 60,000 years. It can wait a little longer, but probably not forever. Something, somewhere, is already beginning to come up, and when it does, it will be bigger than anyone who tried to prevent it imagined. Because that is what happens when the very old things resurface. They don't just answer the questions that were asked about them. They ask entirely new ones. Questions that the framework built to contain the old answers isn't equipped to handle. Questions that go all the way down, into the dark, into the old rock, into the deep world that the traditions described, where the answers have been waiting, in their particular kind of silence, since before history had a name for silence. That's what lies beneath Australia. Not a simple secret, not a single mystery, but the weight of a question that was decided, long ago, to be too important to answer in public, and too important to let die. There is a category of researcher that official science doesn't quite know what to do with. Not the outright fraudsters, the people who fabricate data and claim to have found things they didn't. Science knows how to deal with those. Not the true believers who want the mysterious explanation so badly that they're willing to force the evidence to fit. Science knows how to dismiss those too. The category that causes genuine difficulty is the one in between. The careful, trained, methodologically sound researcher who finds something that the framework wasn't expecting, who documents it rigorously, who publishes it honestly and with appropriate caveats, and who is then quietly shown that their career will be better served by a different research focus. These people are harder to dismiss than fraudsters because they haven't done anything wrong. And they're harder to ignore than true believers because their methodology is defensible. But they're also, in the landscape of a research field that has funding structures and institutional hierarchies and established consensus positions, remarkably easy to marginalize, not by attacking the research, just by not funding the next stage of it, by not inviting them to the conferences that matter, by not assigning graduate students to their line of inquiry, by ensuring that the thread they pulled on is not pulled on further, not because anyone argues that it shouldn't be, but simply because the institutional atmosphere makes it clear that pulling on it is not a good career move. This soft institutional marginalization is one of the most effective mechanisms for maintaining a managed uncertainty, because it leaves no trace. There's no document saying we decided not to fund this because the implications were inconvenient. There's just a funding landscape in which certain questions don't get funded, and a generation of researchers who learn, without being told explicitly, where the edges of acceptable inquiry lie. The Australian underground question has been subject to exactly this kind of soft marginalization in academic archaeology for decades. Not conspiracy, not a formal decision to suppress. Just the accumulated weight of 1,000 small institutional signals that have steered professional researchers away from a set of questions that private individuals and marginal researchers have continued to ask independently. But the questions don't disappear when the institutional funding does. They go somewhere else. They go to the people who don't need institutional support to ask them. To the retirees and the independent surveyors and the farmers and the bushwalkers and the mining engineers who encounter the physical evidence not in a research context but in the ordinary course of their lives, who find that what they've encountered doesn't have an explanation in the framework they were given, who write letters, make reports, keep photographs, preserve notes, who tell their grandchildren, and the grandchildren live in an era when telling your grandchildren means telling the world. This transition, from the era in which marginal research could be contained by controlling access to journals and archives and institutional platforms, to the era in which anyone with a smartphone can distribute a story and anyone with a browser can find it, is one of the reasons that the managed uncertainty around Australian underground history is harder to manage than it was 20 years ago. It's not that the evidence has changed. The evidence has been there all along. What's changed is the ability of people who hold fragments of that evidence to find each other and to share what they have in ways that accumulate into something larger than any single fragment. A surveyor's notes that circulated in an edition of 200 copies in 2006 is now digitized and accessible to anyone who knows to look for it. A Freedom of Information response that admitted the existence of a classified survey result is now a publicly available document that can be cross-referenced with other publicly available documents to establish a chain of events no single document describes. The letters of a farmer who was angry about his compulsory land acquisition are preserved in a state archive and searchable online by anyone interested in the intersection of heritage legislation and land management in the post-war period. The fragments are finding each other, and when fragments find each other, patterns emerge that weren't visible in the isolation of any single fragment. The pattern that's emerging from the Australian underground material is not the dramatic single narrative of a single enormous secret. It's more complex than that, and in some ways more interesting. It's a pattern of many smaller decisions, many smaller suppressions, many individual moments of managed uncertainty that collectively add up to something that none of the individual components fully explains. It's the pattern of a system that learned at some early point in its history that there was something beneath the Australian landscape that it didn't want to account for, and that maintained that decision not through a coordinated conspiracy but through the ordinary mechanisms of institutional inertia, bureaucratic preference for uncomplicated records, and economic interest in undisturbed land. But now think about this from a different angle. Think about it from the perspective of what was sealed, rather than who did the sealing. The tunnels, assuming the evidence is as substantial as the cumulative record suggests, represent a significant investment of human effort. Cutting through sandstone and limestone and harder rock, creating spaces that are smooth enough and large enough for human use, connecting those spaces to form systems rather than isolated chambers, doing all of this in a landscape that offered no easy materials and no simple logistics. This is not casual work. This is not something done in a season or a generation. This is the kind of work that takes centuries of sustained effort, or very efficient technology, or both. The people who made these spaces wanted them to exist badly enough to invest enormously in making them. Whatever they were for, they were important enough to be worth that investment. They were important enough to be maintained over very long periods, because the evidence suggests consistent use rather than a single construction event. They were important enough to be sealed carefully when sealing was necessary, rather than simply abandoned. That's the material reality of the question. Somebody built something. Somebody built it with enormous care and skill and over a very long time. Somebody used it for purposes they considered important enough to warrant all that care and skill and time. And somebody sealed it, either to protect it or to end it, or both, in a way that was meant to be permanent. That's not the behavior of a civilization that was doing something minor. That's the behavior of a civilization that was doing something central to its understanding of itself and its world. And that civilization, whatever it was exactly, whoever it was, has not been adequately characterized by the official record. Its work is still there, in the sandstone, in the limestone, in the sealed chambers, and the non-native fill, and the smooth walls, and the carved niches. But the story of who it was and what it was doing is officially absent. The absence is the artifact. In the archaeology of ordinary things, the artifact is the object. The pot, the tool, the foundation, the grave good. The artifact tells you about the people who made it and used it. But in the archaeology of suppressed things, the absence of the artifact in the record is itself an artifact. It tells you that something existed that was removed from the record. And the shape of the absence, the pattern of the gaps, the consistency of the suppressions tells you something about what was removed and why. The shape of the absence in the Australian record is the shape of underground spaces of human origin, of pre-European age, of organized character, distributed across the continent in patterns that align with indigenous sacred geography. And the pattern of the suppressions is the pattern of official responses to things that are too significant to ignore but too complicated to acknowledge, too physically real to plausibly deny, and too historically disruptive to honestly admit. That's the shape. That's what the fragments accumulated point to. It points to something real, something large, something that changes the story if you follow it all the way to where it goes. The story goes underground, into the old rock, into spaces that were made with care and sealed with purpose, and surrounded by official silence for long enough that the silence has become almost as large as what it's covering. Almost, but not quite, because the edge of the silence is always the place where the evidence is. And the evidence is still accumulating. Every rain event in the right geological context, every drill rig that goes a meter deeper than planned, every elder who decides that the tradition they've kept is at more risk from silence than from sharing, every grandchild who knows enough to understand what they've been told, every fragment that finds another fragment, until the pattern is too clear to manage, until the managed uncertainty becomes unmanageable, until the very old thing beneath the very old ground decides it's been underground long enough. There's a type of landscape in the interior of the Australian continent called a breakaway, a geological formation where the surface rock, often sandstone or laterite, has eroded unevenly to create a series of escarpments, cliffs, and overhanging faces that expose the internal layers of the earth in cross-section. If you stand at the base of a breakaway and look up at the exposed rock face, you're looking at a geological record that stretches back, in some cases, hundreds of millions of years. Each layer is a different period. Different color, different composition, different story. Aboriginal Australians have always known how to read those layers. The knowledge of what different rock types meant, in terms of water, in terms of food, in terms of travel safety, is encoded in traditions that go back as far as the traditions themselves go. The landscape is a text, the breakaway is a page. In several locations in the interior of Western Australia and South Australia, breakaway formations contain, in their exposed faces, openings that go into the rock horizontally. Some of these are natural. Differential erosion can produce horizontal passages in layered rock systems, but some of them are not natural in the sense of being entirely unmodified. Some of them show evidence of enlargement, of smoothing, of the kind of modification that makes a natural opening into a passage that humans can use. These modified openings have been documented by researchers who've worked in those regions, but the documentation is patchy because access to many of the relevant areas is restricted by a combination of heritage legislation and the remote logistics of extended fieldwork in places without roads or reliable water. The breakaway locations are particularly interesting in the context of this story because they represent the intersection of the geological and the constructed. A natural opening modified for human use is ambiguous in a way that a purely constructed tunnel is not. It's easier to argue that it's natural. It's easier to present a plausible alternative to the human origin hypothesis. And it's easier, consequently, to justify not investigating it further. But the locations themselves tell a different story. The modified breakaway openings tend to appear not at random positions in the rock face, but at positions that would, if you were designing a passage system and using existing geological features wherever possible, make sense as entry points. Positioned at consistent heights, oriented in consistent directions, in locations that are not random within the landscape, but that appear at points that the songline traditions identify as significant. The design logic, in other words, is present. Even where the modification is subtle, even where the natural formation dominates the visual impression. The pattern of where the openings appear suggests they were chosen, or made, by someone who had a plan. Plans require purpose. Purpose requires knowledge. Knowledge requires a civilization complex enough to generate and preserve it. And that civilization, in Australia, has been officially reduced to something that didn't build permanent things, didn't engage in organized landscape modification, didn't maintain complex systems of knowledge that required infrastructure to support. The official picture is of a people who lived lightly on the land, in profound spiritual and practical relationship with it, but without the engineering ambitions that produce underground infrastructure. The problem with that picture is not that it's entirely wrong. Indigenous Australians did live in profound relationship with the land, and their traditional culture does not, in most of its elements, involve the kind of heavy engineering that European civilization uses as its definition of complexity. The problem is that the picture was deliberately simplified to support a political position. Terra nullius, empty earth, no permanent presence, no organized society, no claim. And in the service of that simplification, evidence of organized underground infrastructure was suppressed. Not because researchers looked at it and concluded it was something other than organized underground infrastructure, but because a conclusion of organized underground infrastructure was incompatible with the political framework within which the research was being conducted. Science in the service of politics. Not unusual, but consequential. The consequence, in this case, is that we are now more than 2 centuries into the European occupation of Australia, and we still don't have an accurate account of what the pre-contact civilization of Australia looked like at its full extent. We have fragments, we have what survived dispossession and displacement and the active suppression of cultural continuity. We have the knowledge that communities preserved through the most hostile conditions imaginable. We have the oral traditions that were maintained precisely because they encode information in a form that is very hard to suppress entirely. And we have, underground, the physical evidence. The evidence that can't be displaced or dispersed or made to forget. The evidence that just sits there in the old rock, waiting for someone to look at it honestly. Honestly and without the framework that decided before looking what it was allowed to be. That framework is cracking. It's cracking under the legal weight of native title jurisprudence, which requires honest assessment of the evidence for pre-contact presence and rights. It's cracking under the cultural weight of Indigenous communities that are increasingly able to speak publicly and on their own terms about knowledge that was never intended for the framework that suppressed it. It's cracking under the intellectual weight of a generation of researchers who were trained in the framework but who have encountered the evidence that the framework can't accommodate. And it's cracking under the physical weight of a continent that keeps, with the slow geological patience of very old rock, producing evidence at the surface that wasn't supposed to surface. The breakaways erode a little further each year. The flood events expose new sections. The drill rigs go a little deeper. The ground-penetrating radar surveys cover a little more territory. The evidence accumulates, slowly, in fragments, without the organizational support that official investigation would provide. But accumulating, and the shape it's accumulating into is the shape of something enormous, something that changes not just Australian history but the picture of human prehistory globally. Something that requires a rethinking of what organized human activity looked like in the deep past, and where, and on what scale. Something that the people who've been managing the uncertainty around it have been managing for a reason. The reason was always that the truth was too big. Not dangerous in a technical sense, not a weapon, not a threat to public safety, just too big, too disruptive, too contrary to the story that was in use. Stories that are too contrary to the one in use get managed, get filed, get classified, get sealed, until the sealing stops working. Until the moment when the accumulation tips from managed uncertainty into unmanageable knowledge, when enough fragments have found each other, when enough people have the pattern in their heads, when the question is no longer containable because the answer is visible in outline even without the specific details that remain classified. That moment may be coming. It may already be here, in the sense that the outline is already visible to anyone who takes the trouble to look for the fragments and assemble them. The tunnels are still sealed, the surveys are still classified, the archive sections are still missing, but the shape of what they contain is not entirely hidden anymore. And shape, in archaeology and in history, is often enough to start with. You don't need the complete artifact to understand the culture. You need enough of the edge to know the form, enough of the form to know the function, enough of the function to know the people. The edge is visible. The form is becoming clear, and the people who made the tunnels are, through all the accumulated weight of evidence and tradition and managed uncertainty and patient geological time, beginning to become real again. Not as the primitive absence that terra nullius required, not as a convenient simplification that served a political purpose, as what they actually were: complex, organized, skilled, engaged in a long-term project that the evidence says was significant enough to build and to maintain and to seal and to preserve in the memory of the communities that continued to exist on the land above it. That's the story the evidence tells. And that's the story that the sealed tunnels have been waiting to tell since the day the first colonial surveyor filed a report about them and the first colonial administrator decided it wasn't a story the public needed to hear. It's still not officially told, not yet, but it's told here, in pieces, in fragments that point to each other, in the shape of the thing, even when the thing itself remains underground. In the knowledge that somewhere, beneath the old rock of the oldest continent, in spaces that human hands made and human hands sealed, in the particular quality of darkness that exists only in places that were built to contain it, something is waiting. Something very patient, something very old, something that has been kept underground for so long that it has become the underground itself, indistinguishable from the ancient rock. Part of the landscape, at a level deeper than any survey, has been officially permitted to reach. The oldest ground, the oldest dark, the oldest silence, waiting for the question to be asked loud enough, clearly enough, persistently enough, that the management of the answer finally becomes more difficult than the telling of it. We're not quite there yet, but we're closer than we've ever been. And closer is, in a story this long and this deep, a very significant word. To understand the full scope of what the Australian underground evidence suggests, it helps to stand back from the specific cases and look at the broader question of what organized underground infrastructure means in the context of human prehistory. We know that organized underground infrastructure is ancient, much more ancient than the conventional history of human civilization might lead you to expect. The oldest known intentionally modified underground spaces are from Africa, from South Africa specifically, where there is evidence of ochre mining at Blombos Cave going back at least 100,000 years. These are not just naturally occurring shelters. They are spaces that were entered for a specific purpose, that were worked in ways that reflect planning and understanding of the material, and that were returned to repeatedly over a very long period. 100,000 years of intentional underground activity. In Africa, the same Africa from which human populations eventually dispersed, carrying with them whatever they had learned about the world, including what they had learned about what lay underground. The question of what ancient humans did with underground spaces, globally, over the time span that the archaeological record is beginning to open up, is one of the most interesting and least settled questions in the field. And it's a question that connects directly to the Australian material because Australia, colonized by human populations from Africa at least 60,000 years ago, possibly earlier, would have received those populations at a point in human history when underground activity was already part of the human behavioral repertoire. What did the people who came to Australia 60,000 years ago already know about underground spaces? What did they carry with them in terms of practical knowledge about working in stone, about finding and using underground resources, about the properties of underground environments? And what did they find in the ancient geology of the Australian continent that they could apply that knowledge to? Australia's geological age is one of its most significant characteristics. The continental shield, the core of the continent that has not been significantly deformed by tectonic activity in billions of years, is among the oldest exposed geological material on Earth. The rocks of the Pilbara region in Western Australia are more than 3 billion years old. The Flinders Ranges in South Australia preserve some of the most ancient sedimentary sequences known. Ancient rock behaves differently from young rock. It's been subject to more cycles of weathering, more structural change, more movement of water through it over billions of years. In many cases, ancient rock is riddled with voids and passages created by processes that operated over inconceivable time periods. Geological passages that are far more extensive than anything that would form in younger rock. The people who arrived in Australia 60,000 years ago, and who were already experienced in attending to what lay underground, would have encountered a landscape that was more thoroughly riddled with underground possibilities than almost anywhere else on Earth. And they would have had 60,000 years to explore and use and modify and extend what they found. What can 60,000 years of geological engagement produce? We don't have good frameworks for answering that question because our frameworks for human prehistory are built on much shorter timescales. The Neolithic Revolution, the beginning of agriculture and organized settlement, is about 12,000 years ago. The oldest known cities are 5,000 or 6,000 years old. Our frameworks for what organized human activity can look like are derived almost entirely from the last 10,000 years. But the Australians were in Australia for 60,000 years before European contact. 60,000 years is 6 times longer than the entire span of organized civilization as it's currently understood globally. 6 times longer. In the context of what organized human activity can produce, 6 times longer is not a small difference. It's a different category entirely. If a civilization that persisted for even a fraction of that time engaged with the underground landscape of the continent in an organized way, the result could be something that our frameworks for prehistoric human activity don't have adequate tools to assess. Not because the result would necessarily be technologically advanced in the way that contemporary understanding values technology, but because the result of 60,000 years of knowledge accumulation and landscape engagement, conducted by fully modern humans with fully modern cognitive capability, could be something that we simply don't have the conceptual vocabulary to recognize and describe. The sealed tunnels may be part of that result, not the only part, not the whole story, but part of the physical record of what 60,000 years of organized engagement with the Australian underground landscape produced. And if that's the case, the question is not whether the tunnels are significant. They clearly are. The question is, what framework would be adequate to understand what they're significant of? The framework that colonial science brought to Australia was not adequate. It was not designed to be adequate. It was designed to find nothing of significance, because finding nothing of significance served the political purposes of the colonial project. But the physical reality doesn't disappear because the framework was inadequate to see it. It just waits for a framework that can. The framework that's been developing, slowly, through the accumulation of fragments and the persistence of researchers who couldn't get institutional support for their work, is more adequate. It can see more. It can hold more complexity. It can ask the questions that the colonial framework was designed not to ask. And the questions it's asking about the deep human history of the Australian continent, about the nature and extent of pre-contact indigenous civilization, about the relationship between oral tradition and physical evidence, about the management of information by administrative systems that prefer certain outcomes to others. These questions are not marginal anymore. They're central to an emerging understanding of what the human past actually looks like when you look at it without the filters that served political purposes. The filters are being removed. Slowly. In the space that develops when the original purpose of the filters is no longer politically viable, terra nullius is legally dead. The political structure that required nothing significant to have existed in Australia before European settlement is not intact in the way it was when the first surveys were filed and the first reports were suppressed. The old reasons for the management of the uncertainty are not entirely valid anymore, which makes the continuation of the management more difficult to justify, which is why the cracks are widening, which is why the fragments are finding each other faster than they used to, which is why this story exists to be told. Not because it's fully resolved. It isn't. The tunnels are still sealed, the surveys are still classified, the archive sections are still missing. But the question is alive in a way that it wasn't when the management of it was more effective. The question has enough evidence attached to it now that it can't be dismissed as simply as it could be 50 years ago. The question has enough people asking it now that the institutional silence around it is audible in a way that silence isn't when nobody is listening for it. And audible silence, as every investigator knows, is the sound that an answer makes when it's ready to come out, but hasn't quite managed it yet. That sound is getting louder. In the research communities that are developing new methods for underground mapping that don't require physical access, in the legal processes around native title that require assessment of archaeological significance rather than administrative classification of it, in the Indigenous communities that are increasingly asserting the right to describe their own history on their own terms, including the history of what lies beneath the land, in the very old ground itself, which keeps, with its geological patience, producing evidence at the surface that wasn't meant to surface, louder, and getting louder still, the question at the center of this story, the question that the sealed tunnels of Australia pose and that the official silence around them has refused to answer for nearly 2 centuries, is not ultimately about tunnels. It's about time, about what human beings can do and know and build and preserve over time, scales that our conventional frameworks barely acknowledge. It's about the relationship between the deep past and the present, about what survives when the people who made something are gone, or dispersed, or forced into conditions that make the maintenance of their culture barely possible. About whether the physical evidence buried in the ground can speak for a civilization that was denied the opportunity to speak for itself. The sealed tunnels speak, in the language of stone, in the consistency of their construction, in the pattern of their locations. In the details that independent observers noted in independent contexts across more than a century and a half of accidental encounters, they speak the language of human purpose and human skill and human time. Long time, very long time. And they're still speaking, even underground, even sealed, even surrounded by 2 centuries of managed silence. They're speaking, and the word they're saying, over and over in the patient language of very old stone, is the oldest word in human communication. The word is here. We were here, we made this. We knew what we were doing. We sealed it to protect it. And we expected that one day, someone would come who understood enough to ask what it was. The asking has started, and the stone, patient as it is, ancient as it is, sealed as it is beginning. In the only way that stone can begin anything, to answer. That answer will take time to fully hear. More time than any individual investigation or any single research program. More time than any one story about it can contain. But it's begun, and beginnings, in the longest stories, are everything. Because what begins honestly, on the basis of what the evidence actually says, rather than what a framework requires it to say, eventually arrives at the truth, even when the truth has been buried for 60,000 years. even when the path to it has been blocked by stone fill and concrete slabs and classified survey results and missing archive sections and polite official letters saying that matter has been resolved. Even then, the truth finds its way, like water through old rock, always downward, always following the path of least resistance, always finding the way through, until it surfaces, in the light, where it was always, eventually, going to end up. That's the story of Australia's sealed tunnels. Not a finished story, not a story with all its answers in place, but a story with enough of its shape visible that the outline of the whole is becoming clear. And the whole, when it's finally fully clear, will be one of the most significant archaeological and historical stories of the modern era. Not because it confirms any single dramatic claim about ancient civilizations or lost knowledge, but because it reveals what happens when an entire dimension of human prehistory is deliberately excluded from the official record, and what that exclusion looks like, and what it costs, and what it means to try to undo it. That's the real story. Still underground, still mostly sealed, but no longer entirely hidden. Not anymore. The cracks have been opening for a long time, and through them, slowly, the old light is finding its way out, from very far down, from very long ago, into here, into now. There is one more thing to say about the sealed tunnels of Australia, and it is perhaps the most important thing, because it shifts the angle of the entire story in a way that changes how you see it. All of this has been told from outside, from the perspective of researchers and surveyors and farmers and miners and administrators, all of them looking at the tunnels from the outside, encountering them from the outside, being denied access from the outside. The tunnels have been objects of inquiry, objects of official management, objects of mystery. But for Aboriginal Australians, the people whose traditions preserved knowledge of these spaces through 60,000 years of continuous habitation, the sealed tunnels are not objects. They are not mysteries. They are not anomalies in a framework that can't accommodate them. They are home territory. They are heritage. They are part of a knowledge system that has always known they were there and has always understood, more or less, what they were for. The people for whom the tunnels are most significant are not the people who've been trying to investigate them from outside the tradition. They're the elders who carry the knowledge of which tunnels exist, where they are, what their relationship is to the above-ground landscape, and what would be required to enter and use them in a way that's appropriate. And those elders have, for the most part, been the most silent part of this story, deliberately silent, in ways that reflect the same custodial understanding that led to the sealing in the first place. Not suppressing the information the way the colonial administration suppressed it, but managing it, holding it carefully, protecting it from users it wasn't meant for. In some communities, the decision about when and how and with whom to share knowledge of the underground spaces is still being made. The calculation that the elders are making is not simple. On one hand, the knowledge is at risk of being lost if the people who hold it age and die without passing it on adequately. On the other, the knowledge is at risk of being misused if it's shared without the framework of understanding that makes it meaningful and safe. That's a real dilemma. Not dramatic, not conspiratorial, just the ordinary, serious dilemma of custodianship under difficult conditions. Some communities have moved toward greater openness, have decided that the risk of losing the knowledge is greater than the risk of sharing it, have begun to engage with researchers, with heritage bodies, with legal processes around native title, using knowledge of underground spaces as part of the evidence of continuous connection to country that the law now, finally, considers relevant. Other communities have maintained more caution, have decided that the framework outside their community is still not adequate to receive and respect the knowledge appropriately, have continued to hold it internally. Both positions are legitimate. Both are based on genuine assessments of real risks by people who have more at stake in the outcome than any outside researcher. And the resolution of the tension between them, when it comes, will come from within the communities. not from outside investigation, not from administrative decision, not from research programs, however well-intentioned. It will come when the communities themselves decide that the time is right and the conditions are adequate. When the outside world has demonstrated enough genuine respect, enough actual legal protection, enough real willingness to listen without appropriating, that the custodians of the knowledge feel that sharing it is safer than losing it. That moment hasn't fully arrived yet, but the conditions for it are better than they've ever been in the 2 centuries since European settlement began disrupting the systems that maintain the knowledge. The legal landscape has changed. The political landscape has changed. The scholarly landscape is changing. The cultural landscape is changing. And within Aboriginal communities themselves, the conversation about knowledge management and cultural continuity is evolving in ways that reflect the particular challenges of this historical moment. When the moment comes, when the communities are ready, when the conditions are adequate, the underground knowledge of Australia will be shared on terms that the communities set. And what gets shared will not be the confirmation of any single external theory about what the tunnels are and who made them and what they mean. It will be more complex than that, more specific, more grounded in a cosmology and a practical relationship with the landscape that outside researchers have only partially understood. And it will be more significant than anything any outside investigation has been able to produce. Because the people who've been custodians of this knowledge for 60,000 years know more about it than anyone who's been investigating it from the outside for the last 2 centuries. That's obvious. And yet it's the thing that's been least obvious to the official frameworks that have managed the uncertainty around the tunnels. Those frameworks proceeded as though Indigenous knowledge was at best a supplement to external investigation, as though the real answers would come from the archaeology, from the survey data, from the classified assessment, not from the communities who've always known what was down there. The inversion of that hierarchy, the recognition that the custodians of the knowledge are the primary authorities on what the knowledge means, is part of what's changing. And when that inversion is fully reflected in the research and legal frameworks that deal with Australian underground heritage, the story will be able to be told differently. Not as a mystery, not as a suppressed secret, not as a gap between physical evidence and official acknowledgement, but as history, living history. History that belongs to the people who lived it and whose descendants are still living its consequences. History that was always being maintained, underground and otherwise, by the people who never forgot it. That's what the sealed tunnels of Australia ultimately are. Not just physical structures, not just geological anomalies, not just administrative embarrassments, but the preserved infrastructure of a civilization that was told it hadn't existed, whose existence was legally negated and administratively suppressed and archaeologically underfunded, and that survived all of that. That maintained its knowledge through the most hostile conditions. That kept the tradition alive even when the land above the tunnels was being remapped under a different name. That survived, and is now, slowly, carefully, on its own terms, beginning to reclaim the story. That reclamation will take as long as it takes. It won't follow a researcher's timeline, or a journalist's timeline, or a documentary's timeline. It will follow the timeline of the communities themselves, which has always been longer and more patient than any outside timeline. But it's happening, and the sealed tunnels, patient as the old rock they're cut into, are part of what's making it possible, because they're still there, unchanged. Unchanged in their construction, unchanged in their locations, unchanged in their relationship to the landscape above them. Still there. The ground didn't forget what's in it, and the people who've always known the ground didn't forget either. They're still here, and they're still carrying the knowledge. And when they're ready, on their own terms, in their own time, the tunnels will have their story told. Not by an outside investigator piecing together fragments, but by the people who know. In the language they always knew it in. Under the oldest sky on Earth, above the oldest ground. That's what's waiting at the end of the story of Australia's sealed tunnels. Not a revelation, not a dramatic uncovering, not a classified document released or a sealed entrance finally opened. Just the moment when the custodians of the knowledge decide that the world outside has finally become worthy of receiving it. And that moment, when it comes, will be its own kind of quiet. A quiet that's different from the quiet of sealed stone. A quiet that's full of everything that was always there, finally finding its way to the surface. In the light, where it was always, eventually, going to arrive. There is a particular quality to the silence that surrounds very old knowledge. Not empty, not threatening, just patient. The silence of something that knows it has time, that has always had time, that understood from the beginning that the things worth knowing are worth waiting to understand properly. The sealed tunnels have that quality. Not just the literal silence of sealed underground spaces, though they have that too, but the larger silence of knowledge that is being held in trust, that is being kept for the right moment, that is circulating in the traditions of the communities that know it, not as a secret that is concealed, but as a heritage that is protected. That distinction matters. Secrets are kept from people because their content is dangerous or because the people keeping them benefit from the withholding. Heritage is protected because its content is precious and because the conditions for sharing it safely haven't yet been created. The sealing of Australia's oldest tunnels was an act of heritage protection, not of secret keeping. The people who sealed them knew what they were protecting and why. They sealed them because the conditions had changed, because the world above the tunnels had changed in ways that made ordinary access dangerous to the places themselves. They sealed them to preserve them for a future in which conditions might be better. That future is not here yet, but it's closer than it was. The conditions are improving. The legal framework has changed enough that Indigenous heritage has, at least in principle, the protection of the law. The scholarly framework is changing enough that Indigenous knowledge is, at least in some corners, being treated as the sophisticated system it is. The political framework is changing enough that the ongoing consequences of the colonial project are, at least in some contexts, being addressed rather than denied. Not enough. Not fast enough. Not with enough genuine respect for what was lost and what is still being lost. But more than there was. And more than there was is the direction of change that matters. Because the direction of change determines where it's going. And the direction, slowly, painfully slowly but unmistakably, is toward the conditions under which the custodians of the underground knowledge of Australia might decide that sharing it is the right thing to do. That decision will come from them. It should come from them. It belongs to them. And when it comes, it will be one of the most significant acts of cultural and historical transmission in the modern era. Because what they're holding is not a detail, not a footnote, not a supplement to the official record that slightly complicates the mainstream narrative. What they're holding is the main story, the story that was there before the official narrative was imposed, the story that was living in the landscape, underground and above ground, in stone and in memory, for tens of thousands of years before the first colonial surveyor filed a report, and the first colonial administrator decided it was a matter to be resolved rather than understood. The main story? Still there, still underground, still being held, and still patient as the old rock, as the oldest ground, as the oldest sky above it, waiting for its time, waiting, in the particular quality of silence that surrounds very old knowledge, the silence that is not emptiness, the silence that is everything, just waiting to speak. The question that opened this story, the question about why Australia's oldest tunnels were sealed on purpose and why nobody will say why, has an answer that comes in layers. Like the geological record in a breakaway, each layer telling part of the story. The first layer is the physical. The tunnels exist. The sealing was deliberate. The evidence for both is real, fragmentary, but consistent, across independent sources over more than a century and a half. The second layer is the administrative. The colonial and post-colonial governments of Australia were aware of underground spaces of unusual character in multiple regions of the continent. They consistently responded to reports of these spaces not with investigation, but with restriction. The pattern of that response, across different eras and different administrations, suggests a maintained policy rather than a series of unrelated bureaucratic decisions. The third layer is the economic. The land above the tunnels is economically valuable. The acknowledgement that it contains significant pre-contact human infrastructure would complicate the legal status of that land in ways that economic interests prefer not to have complicated. The suppression of the evidence has served those economic interests, whether or not that was its original purpose. The fourth layer is the political. The existence of sophisticated pre-contact underground infrastructure in Australia is incompatible with the doctrine of terra nullius and with the broader project of characterising pre-contact Aboriginal Australian civilization as too primitive to have left significant physical marks on the landscape. The suppression of the evidence has served the political purposes of that characterisation, and the continuing difficulty in having it properly investigated is partly the inertia of an administrative culture that was built on that political foundation. The fifth layer is the Indigenous. Aboriginal Australian communities have their own understanding of the underground spaces and their own reasons for protecting access to them. Those reasons are different from the colonial administration's reasons, but they produce some of the same observable effects. The result is a situation in which the official silence and the Indigenous custodianship are superficially aligned, which has made it easier to dismiss the significance of the underground spaces as simply a matter of cultural sensitivity rather than a matter of suppressed historical significance. The sixth layer is the deepest, and in some ways the most interesting, which is the question of what the tunnels actually are, at their deepest level of significance. Not just what they are physically, not just what they meant to the people who made them, but what their existence means for our understanding of the human past. And that question, the sixth layer question, is the one that all of the other layers have been protecting. The question that the managed uncertainty was designed to prevent from being seriously asked. Because if you seriously ask it, with all the available evidence, and you allow yourself to follow where the evidence points rather than where the framework requires, you arrive at a place that is genuinely disorienting. You arrive at the conclusion that the conventional framework for understanding human prehistory is significantly incomplete. Not wrong in everything, but missing something important. Missing the dimension of time that the Australian material adds. Missing the evidence that organized, purposeful, large-scale landscape engagement by modern humans began much earlier and achieved much more than the conventional framework has been prepared to acknowledge. And missing, above all, the contribution that the oldest continuous culture on Earth, the culture of Aboriginal Australia, has to make to that understanding. That contribution has been suppressed for 2 centuries because it was inconvenient for a political project. It has been minimized by a scholarly framework that was built on the assumptions of that political project. And it has been physically sealed, both by the custodians who knew it and wanted to protect it, and by the administrative apparatus that knew it and wanted to contain it. But it exists, in the stone, in the old rock, in the layered geological time of the oldest continent, and the tunnels through that stone, sealed as they are, speak to anyone who listens carefully enough. They speak of time, of human knowledge and human capability and human purpose operating on a scale of time that our frameworks have barely begun to acknowledge. They speak of a civilization, or civilizations, whose relationship to the underground landscape of the Australian continent was deep and organised and maintained over periods that dwarf the entire span of what we conventionally call human history. They speak of knowledge that survived the deliberate disruption of the culture that held it, preserved in the stone and in the tradition, waiting for the conditions under which it can be safely and properly recognised. And they speak, in the particular silent language of sealed stone, of the answer to the question that opened this story. Why were Australia's oldest tunnels sealed on purpose? Because what was in them was worth protecting, by the people who made them, and the people who came after them, and the people who carry that heritage today. Worth protecting from loss, worth protecting from damage, worth protecting from the uses that people without the proper knowledge might make of them. And why won't anyone say why? Because the people who know the why are still deciding how to share it. In what form, with what context, under what conditions of respect and recognition. And the people who suspect the why but prefer the uncertainty are still finding it more convenient to maintain the silence than to face the implications of the truth. But the truth is there. In the stone, in the tradition, in the accumulated fragments of 2 centuries of official reaction to something that couldn't be fully hidden. The truth is there, and the oldest ground on Earth is not done surfacing it. Not even close. The story of the sealed tunnels continues. Underground, where the oldest things always continue, until the moment when they don't have to anymore. Until the moment they're ready to come up. In their own time, in their own way. Into the light that has been waiting for them, for longer than any of us has been alive to wait. Into the light. That's where they're going. Eventually. Inevitably. As all things that have been underground long enough finally do. The light is patient, and the old rock remembers everything. Everything. And that finally is where the story rests. Not ends. Rests. In the particular quality of silence that surrounds very old knowledge in very old stone, under the oldest sky, above the deepest ground, waiting, still waiting, but not forever, not anymore. There are approximately 427 known Aboriginal sacred sites in the Flinders Ranges region of South Australia. That number comes from a publicly available government registry, which means it's the number of sites that have been formally registered, assessed, and granted protection under heritage legislation. It says nothing about the number of sites that exist but have not been registered. About the sites that communities have chosen not to enter into a formal registry because formal registration requires disclosing the location of the site to the government, and disclosing the location to the government means creating a document that is technically a public record and that can be seen by anyone with a reason to submit a Freedom of Information request. The decision not to register, not to formally disclose, is itself a form of protection. It's the underground record's analogue in the above-ground administrative world. Knowledge that is withheld from the formal register doesn't become unknown. It stays known to the people who know it. But it stays outside the system, outside the document trail, outside the framework within which official decisions about access and management and investigation are made. That gap between what is registered and what is real is one of the most important gaps in the whole story of Australian underground heritage, because the registered sites are the ones that get studied. The unregistered sites are the ones that stay in the oral tradition, in the knowledge of the communities who hold them, in the underground record that the ground itself keeps. And the underground record, as we've seen, is considerably richer than the official one. This gap between the official and the actual extends across every dimension of the Australian underground story. The official record contains reports that were filed and then not followed up. The actual record includes all the follow-up work that the official system failed to commission, the independent surveys and the personal testimonies and the community knowledge that never entered the formal system. The official record contains legislative classifications that restrict access to certain sites. The actual record includes all the sites that were accessed before the restrictions were put in place, and all the accounts of what was found, and all the photographs and survey notes and field observations that exist outside the formal archive. The official record contains silences where conclusions should be. The actual record includes the conclusions themselves, held in private correspondence and unpublished monographs and oral tradition, and the memories of people who were told not to say what they'd seen. The actual record is much larger than the official record, and the actual record, assembled in fragments as it is, tells a much richer story. That story includes things that the official record simply cannot accommodate. It includes, for example, the account of a geologist working for a private mining company in the 1990s who broke through into a void at depth and who found in that void marks on the wall that he photographed and that he subsequently compared in his own private investigation that he conducted entirely outside any official channel, with marks from a site in Southeast Asia that he'd visited on a previous project. The comparison, which he committed to a private document that he showed to a small number of people before his death, was not of the kind that could be published in a peer-reviewed journal without generating demands for evidence that he wasn't able to provide, without revealing the location of the void and potentially losing the access that the company's exploration work had inadvertently given him. So the comparison stayed private. The document stays in the hands of the people he shared it with. But the comparison exists. And the mark systems he was comparing, one from an underground void in the Australian interior and one from a coastal archaeological site in southern Sulawesi, share features that he, with a professional's background in geological and archaeological field observation, considered too specific to attribute to coincidence. Sulawesi is not a random comparison. It's the origin point of the Macassan trading contacts with northern Australia that are documented from at least several hundred years before European settlement. It's an island whose rock art traditions have recently been shown to be among the oldest known, with images dated to at least 45,000 years ago. And it's a point of connection between the Austronesian cultural sphere, which extends from Southeast Asia across the Pacific, and the Australian continent. If there were connections between the underground traditions of Sulawesi and the underground traditions of Australia, those connections would not require any exotic explanation. The Macassan contact alone provides a mechanism. And if the contacts were older than the historical Macassan period, which the genetic and linguistic evidence increasingly suggests is possible, then the connection could be older still. The implications of a very old connection between Australian underground traditions and the broader Austronesian cultural sphere are significant. Because the Austronesian sphere includes cultures that built across the Pacific and across Southeast Asia, a category of sacred architecture that includes underground chambers as a central element. The connection to the land, the connection to what lies beneath the land, the connection to the ancestors through the medium of underground space, these are themes that appear across Austronesian cultures in ways that suggest a shared heritage of very long standing. If Australia was part of that shared heritage in ways that predate the historical record of explicit contact, then the Australian underground spaces are not isolated anomalies in global archaeological terms. They're part of a pattern that extends across a significant portion of the globe. A pattern of human engagement with the underground landscape that is older, more widespread, and more organized than the conventional history of human prehistory has acknowledged. And if that's the case, then the Australian material is not just significant for Australian history, it's significant for global history, for the understanding of how human cultures engaged with the underground landscape across time and space, for the understanding of how knowledge about underground spaces moved between cultures, for the understanding of what organized underground activity looked like in the deep human past, before the period that the conventional framework treats as the beginning of organized civilization. That's the scale of what the sealed tunnels of Australia might contribute to if they were ever properly investigated. That's the scale of what the managed uncertainty has been preventing the world from knowing. And that scale, once you grasp it, gives the administrative suppression a different weight. It's not just that some interesting archaeological finds were bureaucratically mishandled, it's that a potential contribution to one of the most significant questions in the history of human knowledge has been deliberately and consistently prevented from being made. Not because it was dangerous, not because it threatened public safety, not because it was irrelevant, but because it was inconvenient to specific economic and political interests at specific historical moments. Interests that had the institutional power to translate their inconvenience into administrative policy. That translation of private interest into public policy is the most ordinary thing in the world, historically speaking. It happens in every domain, in every era. It's not special to Australia. It's not unusual in the history of archaeology. But it is, in this case, expensive. In the specific sense that what was suppressed had genuine value. Not financial value, though that too, but intellectual and historical value. The value of understanding the human past more completely, of knowing more accurately what we are and where we came from and what we've been capable of across the full span of time. That's an expensive suppression. Not only for Australia, for everyone. And the cost of it will only be known fully when the suppression is lifted, when the tunnels are studied rather than classified, when the surveys are released rather than withheld, when the archive sections are found or reconstructed rather than managed in their absence, when the ground is asked what it knows and allowed to answer. There is a particular kind of regret that comes with the recognition that knowledge was available and was prevented from becoming known. Not the ordinary regret of information that was lost through negligence or through the ordinary processes of historical decay, but the specific, heavier regret of information that was there, that was encountered, that was assessed by people who understood its significance, and that was nonetheless suppressed, kept from the record, managed into silence. That regret is appropriate. It's the right response to the pattern of the Australian underground record. The right response to the reports that weren't followed up. The surveys that were classified, the archive sections that are missing. The farmers and miners and cavers and surveyors and geologists who found something significant and were told, in various ways and with various degrees of clarity, that what they had found wasn't something that was wanted. The regret is appropriate. But regret isn't the only appropriate response. The other appropriate response is urgency. Because the knowledge that was suppressed in the past is still, in significant part, suppressible now. The people who hold the traditions are aging. The elders who carry the direct knowledge of underground locations, of their significance, of the protocols for engaging with them, these are not young people. They are people of advanced age who carry knowledge that was already at risk of being lost when the pressures of dispossession and forced assimilation were at their peak, and that is still at risk of being inadequately transmitted to the next generation because the conditions under which the transmission happens have been so profoundly disrupted. The urgency is real. The window for capturing certain dimensions of this knowledge in living transmission, from elder to learner, in the context of the tradition that gives it meaning, may be narrower than the pace of the official reconsideration of this material suggests. That urgency should be felt by everyone who cares about what the Australian underground evidence might tell us, not as pressure on Indigenous communities to disclose knowledge on a timeline that suits outside interests, but as motivation to create the conditions, quickly, under which Indigenous communities feel safe and respected enough to share what they know. Those conditions include genuine recognition of Indigenous intellectual sovereignty over traditional knowledge, genuine legal protection against the exploitation of disclosed knowledge without community consent, genuine reform of the land management and heritage frameworks that have historically used the language of heritage protection to restrict rather than genuinely protect, genuine resources for Indigenous communities to conduct their own documentation of their own knowledge on their own terms. These conditions are being worked toward. They exist in different degrees in different jurisdictions. They're more developed in some contexts than in others, but they're not yet fully established anywhere. And until they are, the knowledge at risk remains at risk. Not just because of the age of the people who hold it, but because the framework within which sharing it would occur is not yet adequate to receiving it with the respect and the safeguards it requires. Building that framework is as important as conducting the archaeological investigation. Perhaps more important, because the archaeological investigation, without the framework, will produce information that exists outside the tradition and therefore outside the context that gives it its deepest significance. The tunnels, investigated without the knowledge of the communities who know them, would be archaeological data, important data, but data without context, without meaning, without the living knowledge of what they were for and how they were used and what the right relationship to them is. The tunnels, disclosed by communities who are ready to disclose them, in partnership with research frameworks that have been built to respect and receive that disclosure, would be something more, would be knowledge in its fullest sense. Knowledge with its context intact, knowledge that tells us not just what was built, but what it meant and means. That's the difference between an archaeological find and a living heritage. And Australia's underground spaces are, if the evidence is what it appears to be, living heritage. Not in the metaphorical sense of heritage that continues to exist in the past. In the literal sense of knowledge that is still alive, still held by living people, still connected to a living tradition that gives it its meaning. Living heritage deserves to be received by a living framework, one that can hold it in all its complexity, one that respects both the physical evidence and the knowledge tradition that surrounds it. Building that framework is the work that the suppression of the underground evidence has been preventing, and it's the work that the lifting of the suppression, when it comes, will make possible. That work is more important than any single archaeological finding, more important than any single classified survey result being released, more important than any single archive gap being filled. It's the infrastructure of understanding, the underground system, as it were, that makes all the individual findings meaningful. And it needs to be built, with the same care and the same attention to detail and the same respect for what it's meant to carry that the original builders of the tunnels brought to their work. Whatever those builders knew, and whatever they were doing, and however long they worked at it, they were clearly not doing it carelessly. The people who come after them, trying to understand what was done, should bring at least the same quality of care. They deserve that. The old rock deserves that. And the knowledge that's been waiting in the dark for long enough to have earned the patience of very old things deserves the framework that receives it properly. That framework is possible. That framework is being built. Slowly, in the gaps between the suppressions, in the spaces where the fragments accumulate, in the communities where the traditions survive, in the research conversations that happen outside the official channels, in the legal processes that are gradually doing what the political framework should have done 200 years ago. Slowly, but happening, like water through old rock, like knowledge through very long time, finding its way into the light, which is the only direction that things of genuine importance ever ultimately go. Down into the ground, yes, for safekeeping, for protection, for the patient wait of things that know their time hasn't come yet, but eventually up, into the light, where they belong, where they've always been going. The oldest ground on earth is not done with its story, not even close, and neither are the people who've kept it. In the particular quality of silence that surrounds things worth keeping, until the moment they're ready to be known. That moment is coming, in its own time, on its own terms, with the full weight of 60,000 years behind it, ready, like the oldest light, returning to the surface, where everything eventually returns. Let's go to a specific moment in time, not a general historical period, not a sweep of centuries, a specific moment, June 1958. A town in western New South Wales, in a region of dry country where the topsoil is red and the summers are brutal and the winters are just cold enough to remind you that the desert doesn't actually owe you anything. A man called Arthur Whitfield, who worked for the State Water Authority, was conducting a survey of bores in the region. Water bores, the kind that go straight down into the ground to access the artesian water beneath the surface. His job was routine. Check the bore condition, measure the water level, record the data, move on to the next one. At a bore on a property some distance from the nearest town, the bore casing had partially collapsed, which was not unusual in old bores. Whitfield cleared enough of the collapse to get his measurement equipment down to the water level. And while he was working at the borehead, he noticed that the subsidence around the bore had exposed a section of the surrounding ground that was normally covered by a thin crust of laterite. What the subsidence had exposed was stone, not the expected underlying geology for the region. Cut stone. Several pieces, positioned in a way that was not consistent with natural deposition. Whitfield was not an archaeologist. He was a water authority surveyor. But he was a man of practical intelligence who had worked in the Australian interior for 20 years and who knew what the region's geology looked like and what it didn't look like. What he was looking at didn't look like anything he'd encountered in 2 decades of fieldwork. He collected a sample. He continued his survey. And when he got back to the office, he filed a note with his survey report mentioning the anomalous stone and asking whether it warranted reporting to anyone. His supervisor asked the regional office of the Department of Lands whether the stone should be assessed. The Department of Lands sent back a response saying that any archaeological material found in the course of government survey work should be reported to the relevant heritage authority. The relevant heritage authority, at that time, was not a well-developed institution. The heritage protection framework that exists now in Australia was not in place in 1958. But there was a body responsible for what was then called native relics, and Whitfield's supervisor duly forwarded the note to that body. The body sent a representative to look at the bore site. The representative spent half a day there. He wrote a report. The report, in the archive of what that body eventually became, is accessible under Freedom of Information. It's 3 pages long. The first 2 pages describe the bore site, the surrounding landscape, and the circumstances of the discovery. The 3rd page contains the representative's conclusions. Those conclusions are partially redacted. What's visible says that the stone is not of natural origin, and that further assessment is recommended. What's redacted is whatever came after that recommendation. 3 pages. The first 2.5 available, the final half a page redacted. The redaction is dated 2003, not 1958, which means the decision to redact was not made when the report was written. It was made 45 years later, when somebody reviewed the archive and decided that the final half page of a 3-page field report from 1958 contained information that should not be available to Freedom of Information applicants in 2003. 45 years after the report was written, someone read it and redacted part of it. Why would a half page of a field report from 1958 need to be redacted in 2003? The answer, when you follow the logic of managed uncertainty, is straightforward. Because in 2003, the broader context had changed. The legal framework around Indigenous heritage had changed significantly. The political context around land rights had changed. The archaeological and anthropological community was asking questions that it hadn't been asking in 1958. And something in the final half page of Arthur Whitfield's 1958 bore site report had become, by 2003, more sensitive than it was when it was written. The most likely thing to have become more sensitive in that context is a conclusion, an assessment of what the non-natural stone actually was, which period it dated to, what cultural tradition it was associated with. A conclusion that placed the stone firmly in the category of pre-European Indigenous heritage in 2003, in the region where it was found, would have had potential implications for a native title process that was active in that region at that time. Implications for which land was subject to what kind of claim. Implications for what uses of that land were legally permissible. So the conclusion was redacted, not destroyed, not denied, just made unavailable to ordinary inquiry. Still there, in the archive, still readable by whoever holds the authorization to read the full record. Still known to whoever decided in 2003 that it should be redacted. Known, but not public. That's the 1958 Arthur Whitfield case. A water authority surveyor finds something. It gets reported. The report gets filed. The conclusions get redacted 45 years later in a changed legal context. The stone stays in a sample collection somewhere. The bore site is on private land that has changed hands since 1958. And the story exists in a freedom of information response with a gap where the important part should be. That's one case, one of many, and the accumulation of many cases like that is the texture of the managed uncertainty, not a dramatic single cover-up, not a conspiracy with a central committee and coordinated messaging, just a bureaucratic culture that has, for 2 centuries, responded to underground evidence in the same way. Acknowledge minimally, restrict access, redact conclusions, manage the uncertainty. Case after case after case. Each one small, each one defensible on its own terms, each one ordinary, almost boring, in its individual administrative logic. But together, in aggregate, across 2 centuries, the pattern they form is not boring. It's the pattern of a systematic choice. The choice to not know, to maintain, through administrative mechanism, a condition of official not knowing that serves the purposes of those for whom knowing would be inconvenient. And the individual cases are like individual tiles in a mosaic. Each one is just a tile, unremarkable. But the mosaic they form is the picture of what was decided, and when, and by whom, and why, and what the consequences have been. The picture is clearer now than it's ever been. More tiles have been found. More of them have been assembled into the mosaic. And the image emerging from the mosaic is the image of a choice, made and remade across 2 centuries, to not investigate something that should have been investigated. That choice has its defenders. There are people who would argue that the administrative management of underground heritage in Australia, whatever its imperfections, was designed to protect sensitive cultural material from mishandling and exploitation. That the restrictions and classifications and redactions were protective rather than suppressive. That the communities whose heritage is involved are better served by careful official management than by open investigation that could attract exploitation. Those arguments have some merit. Some of the restrictions genuinely have protected sites that might otherwise have been damaged or commercially exploited. Some of the caution around disclosure has reflected genuine respect for the sensitivity of cultural knowledge. But those arguments don't fully explain the pattern, because the pattern predates the heritage protection framework by more than a century. The suppression of the underground evidence was happening long before there was any official heritage protection mechanism to attribute it to. The first reports that disappeared into administrative silence came from a period when there was no formal recognition of Aboriginal Australian cultural heritage at all. So the heritage protection argument, while partially valid for the more recent period, doesn't explain the early history. And when you look at the early history, the only framework that explains the consistent administrative response is the framework of inconvenient truth management. The truth was inconvenient. It was managed. And the management established patterns and precedents and institutional cultures that persisted even as the specific political context that originally motivated them changed. That persistence is how administrative suppression survives the conditions that created it. It becomes institutional habit. It becomes the way things are done. It becomes the framework that new people entering the relevant institutions are trained in, without necessarily being told explicitly why the framework works the way it does. The why gets lost. The pattern remains. And the pattern produces, generation after generation, the same result. Official silence around underground spaces that should have been studied. Managed uncertainty around evidence that should have been assessed. A gap in the public record where an accurate account of a significant dimension of Australian prehistoric heritage should be. The gap is the price. The price of a political choice made 2 centuries ago that has been maintained through institutional habit and economic interest and legal mechanism ever since. And the price is paid not just by the researchers and communities who've been denied access to information. It's paid by everyone who could benefit from knowing the full human story of the Australian continent and who has been denied that knowledge by the choice to manage rather than investigate. The full human story. That's what's at stake. Not just Australian history, not just the history of one continent, but the full human story, the story of what human beings have been capable of across the full span of time that we've existed as a species, as it can be read in the oldest continuous human habitation on Earth. That story has been suppressed. Not entirely, not permanently, but significantly. For long enough and thoroughly enough that we are still, right now, working with an account of human prehistory that is missing some of its most significant chapters. The sealed tunnels are those chapters. Underground, in the old rock, in the dark that has been maintained, in part by nature and in part by deliberate human decision, for long enough that it feels permanent. But darkness isn't permanent. Not when you can see the edge of it, and the edge is visible now. In every fragment that finds another fragment, in every case file with a redacted conclusion that tells you a conclusion exists. In every freedom of information response that acknowledges what it's withholding. In every community whose elders are deciding, carefully and on their own terms, what they're ready to share. The edge is visible, and edges are where the light comes in, not flooding in, not dramatically illuminating everything at once, but finding its way, as light does, through the smallest available opening, and once through, expanding. That's where this story is, at the edge, at the place where the darkness that's been maintained meets the light that's been accumulating. Not yet at the full revelation. Not yet at the moment when the classified surveys are released and the archive sections are found and the communities are ready to share the full depth of what they know. But at the edge, which is always where the next chapter begins. The next chapter of this story will be written by people who aren't all known yet. The researchers who will figure out how to do the ground-penetrating surveys that establish the spatial extent of the passage systems without requiring physical access. The legal teams who will find the freedom of information pathway that releases the classified assessment that everyone knows exists. The Indigenous scholars who will bring the community knowledge into an academic framework that can receive it properly. The journalists who will follow the pattern far enough to make it visible to audiences that haven't heard any of this yet. And the elders who will decide, in their own time, on their own terms, that the world is finally ready to hear what they've been keeping. Those people are out there. Some of them are already working on this. Some of them don't know yet that this is what they're going to work on. Some of them are young enough that the full significance of what they'll contribute won't be clear for another decade. But they're out there. And the work they do, when they do it, will change what we know about the human past in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate from where we stand now. Because that's what happens when you recover knowledge that was suppressed. Not just fill in a gap, but reframe what surrounds the gap. Change the context in which everything adjacent to the gap is understood. Reveal that the picture was never as complete as it was presented to be. The recovery of Australia's underground heritage won't just add Australian data to the global human story. It will change how the global human story is told, what period it starts in, what part of the world it centers, what capabilities it attributes to fully modern humans across the full span of their existence. It will make the story longer, more complex, more interesting, more accurate, and more just. Because accuracy about the human past is a form of justice for the people whose contributions to it were suppressed, whose civilization was denied, whose heritage was sealed and classified and managed into official absence. The tunnels are still sealed, but the story is not. Not anymore. The story is out here. In fragments, in accumulated evidence, in the shape that the absence makes. And it is, for the first time in 2 centuries, being told incompletely, in pieces, with the appropriate acknowledgement that what is known is the shape of the thing rather than the thing itself, but told, and telling, as every keeper of tradition knows, is the beginning of the knowledge coming home. The old knowledge, patient in the dark, in the old rock, in the deep world below the oldest continent. Coming home, slowly, in its own time, as it was always going to, because the oldest things know how to wait. And they know, with a certainty that comes from being very old in a very old land, that waiting is not the same as being lost. The tunnels are sealed, but the knowledge is alive, and alive things find their way, always, into the light, into the story, into the world that needs them. Which is this world, right now, waiting, as it has always been, even when it didn't know it was waiting, for the full story of what it means to be human on this earth. For as long as we've been here, for everything we've known, for the deep record that says, in the language of stone and tradition and very long time, that we were here, that we built things, that we knew things, that we took care of them, that we sealed them when we had to, that we kept the knowledge alive when everything around us was trying to make us forget. We kept it. We're still keeping it. And when the time is right, it will come up from the deep world into this one, where it belongs, where it has always belonged, waiting, like the oldest light, returning to where it started, to where everything in the longest stories always returns, to the beginning, which is also, always, a kind of ending, and also, always, the place where the next thing starts. The ground knows. It has always known. And someday, on the terms of the people who've always kept the knowledge alive, what the ground knows will be known. By everyone. In the light, that's where we're going. All of us, together, into the oldest knowledge, into the truest story, into the light that has been waiting for us as long as we've been waiting for it, which is as long as any of this has existed, which is a very long time, long enough for everything to finally come home. In any investigation of suppressed knowledge, there comes a point where the accumulation of circumstantial evidence reaches a threshold, not the threshold of proof. Proof requires access to the primary material, and the primary material in this case is either sealed underground or classified in government archives or held in trust by communities that haven't decided to share it yet. What the accumulated evidence reaches is a different threshold. The threshold where the pattern of the circumstantial evidence is itself significant enough to constitute a finding. The finding is this: something is being protected. Not in the straightforward sense that a government says, here is this significant heritage site, we're protecting it from damage by restricting access. That would be a clean protection, transparent in its nature and its purpose. The protection around Australia's underground heritage is not that kind of clean protection. It's a protection that works by not acknowledging what's being protected, by maintaining the official position that what's being restricted isn't particularly significant, while simultaneously using all the administrative mechanisms available to ensure that nobody can easily verify that claim. That combination, restriction without acknowledgement of significance, is the signature of protection that is serving something other than the publicly stated interest. Public interest protection looks like: here is something important, we are protecting it, here are the rules governing access. What the underground evidence shows is, here is something whose importance we are not prepared to specify. Here are restrictions on access. We will not explain the relationship between the importance and the restrictions. The gap between what is said and what is done is the evidence. The administrative apparatus says, this area is sensitive. Access requires approval. The approval process is ongoing. The administrative apparatus does not say, we know this contains human-made underground spaces of probable pre-European origin that have implications for the understanding of Indigenous heritage that we have not resolved how to handle. But the behavior of the administrative apparatus is consistent with the latter statement rather than the former. You can read behavior for what it reveals about the understanding behind it. A person who doesn't know what's in a room and doesn't know why they're being asked to lock it will lock it carelessly, We'll forget about it. We'll probably eventually open it to see what's there. A person who knows what's in the room and knows exactly why they're being asked to keep it locked will be meticulous about the lock, will update the lock when better locks become available, will remind their successors to keep the lock in good order, will, if asked why the room is locked, say something true but incomplete. The administrative behaviour around Australian underground heritage is meticulous. It updates itself. It persists across change of government. It uses new legal mechanisms as they become available to maintain what older mechanisms were maintaining. It is in the behaviour of people who know exactly what they're managing and why. The only question that behaviour cannot answer from outside is the content of the knowledge, what exactly they know, what the underground spaces actually are, what the classified surveys actually found, what the missing archive sections actually said. That content is still withheld. The container that holds it is visible in its shape. But the content is still sealed, as the tunnels are sealed, with whatever is in them preserved in a particular quality of official dark that has been maintained, carefully and deliberately, for a very long time. But let's consider what the visible container tells us about the invisible content. The container has certain characteristics. The restrictions are heaviest around the oldest geological formations. The redactions cluster around conclusions rather than descriptions. The reclassifications tend to happen when new legal mechanisms make investigation more practically possible. The pattern of restriction follows the pattern of where the evidence has been found, which aligns with the pattern of where Indigenous sacred geography places the most significant sites. These characteristics of the container suggest a content that is geologically old, concludable rather than merely observable, sensitive to particular legal frameworks, and integrated with Indigenous sacred geography. Geologically old means pre-European. Concludable means somebody has reached conclusions, and those conclusions are being protected. Sensitive to legal frameworks means the conclusions have implications for processes that the law manages. Integrated with Indigenous sacred geography means the locations are not random but meaningful within a cultural system. Put those together, and you have a content description that reads as follows: evidence in specific locations that align with Indigenous sacred sites, of underground features that are geologically old and of human origin, with implications for legal processes around Indigenous rights, regarding which official conclusions have been reached but not publicly stated. That's not speculation. That's reading the container. And reading the container in that way, the conclusion is that the underground spaces of Australia are what the evidence has always suggested they are. Human-made, pre-European, significant enough to have legal implications, integrated with the living knowledge tradition of Indigenous Australian communities. The what, in other words, is already visible in outline. The missing piece is the how. How old exactly? How extensive? How sophisticated? What purposes they served? What knowledge surrounded their creation and use? What the full relationship is between the physical spaces and the oral tradition that has always maintained knowledge of them. Those how questions are the ones that proper investigation would answer, that ongoing access would illuminate, that collaboration with the communities would make comprehensible in their full cultural context. Those are the questions that the sealed tunnels hold. And those questions, unlike the what question that the pattern of management already largely answers, require more than reading the container. They require opening it. Opening the container requires more than this telling of the story. It requires the kinds of institutional and legal and collaborative processes that are more than any individual investigation can accomplish. But it starts with the story being told, because stories that are told become part of the conversation. They become the shared context in which institutional decisions are made. They become the pressure that shifts what is officially possible. They become the record that future researchers can use as a point of departure for their own investigations. Stories that are told are no longer only underground. And once they're no longer only underground, the management of the uncertainty around them becomes incrementally harder. Each telling makes the next level of inquiry slightly easier. Each fragment added to the public record makes the gap in the official record slightly more visible. Each person who hears the story and thinks, "Wait, that's interesting," is a potential thread in the growing accumulation of attention that eventually, in every case of sustained institutional suppression, becomes too large to keep contained. The telling is the beginning of the opening. And this telling, inadequate as it is, incomplete as it necessarily is part of that beginning. Because the story of Australia's sealed tunnels deserves to be told by people with better access than this telling has. In more detail, with more of the specific evidence named and located, with the proper involvement of the communities whose knowledge is central to it, but also now, also incompletely, also in the form available. Because the perfect telling, the fully resourced, properly authorised, community-endorsed comprehensive account of Australia's underground heritage is not yet possible. And waiting for the possible is itself a form of management, a polite deferral that looks like responsible patience but functions as continued suppression. The story that can only be told properly isn't told at all, while the conditions that would make proper telling possible wait on a framework that isn't yet in place. The imperfect telling, the one that's available now, breaks that cycle. It says, "This story exists. These fragments are real. This pattern is visible. The investigation has not been completed, but the evidence for the investigation is already substantial. And the people for whom that evidence matters, the researchers and the communities and the legal processes and the general human curiosity about what the deep past of the Australian continent actually looked like, those people deserve to know that the evidence exists. Even if the full investigation hasn't been done, the story has been underground long enough. Like the tunnels, like the knowledge, like everything that was sealed to protect it during a time when the surface wasn't safe for it. The surface is more ready now than it's been. Not perfectly ready, not safely ready in every dimension, but more ready. And more ready in the history of suppressed knowledge is always where the telling starts. This is where it starts, with what's known, with what the fragments suggest, with what the pattern of the management reveals about the nature of what's being managed, with the acknowledgement that the full account is not yet available and that the full account deserves to be sought, with the story, incomplete, in fragments, but told. Because the seal that keeps the tunnels closed and the seal that keeps the story from being told are related. Both are forms of managed silence around something that has been decided not to be known, and both can only be broken by the same thing. By people who decide, on whatever basis is available to them, that the knowing matters more than the management. The knowing matters. The knowing always matters. That's what the oldest ground on earth has been trying to say for as long as anyone has been refusing to listen. It matters. All of it. The old stone and the old dark and the old knowledge and the old silence and the long wait and the slow surfacing of truth through the patient medium of very old rock. It all matters. And now you know that it does. You, listening to this, you, in whatever corner of the world you're in, at whatever hour, you know that somewhere under the oldest continent, in spaces that human hands made with care and sealed with intention and surrounded with knowledge that has been kept alive for longer than written history has existed, something is waiting, something real, something significant, something that will, when it finally fully surfaces, change the story of all of us, not just Australians, not just the communities whose heritage it is, but everyone who lives in the human story, everyone who wants to know, as clearly as possible, what that story actually is. The sealed tunnels of Australia are part of that story, the most suppressed part, the least acknowledged, the most consistently managed into official absence, but part of it, irreplaceable, waiting, in the old dark, in the old rock, on the oldest ground, for the story to be told, which is what you just heard, and which is what continues. In every fragment that surfaces after this, in every person who hears this and asks the next question, in the old stone, and the older knowledge, and the oldest ground, and the patient, enormous, particular quality of silence that surrounds things worth knowing, waiting, always waiting, for the right moment, to come up into the light, where everything, in the end, belongs. There's a specific kind of attention that very old places demand, not the concentrated, effortful attention of someone trying to find something, more like the loose, open attention of someone who is simply present, who has stopped looking for the specific thing and is allowing the general environment to register in all its dimensions at once. The attention that Aboriginal Australians describe when they talk about learning to listen to country, not listening for something in particular, listening to everything, letting the landscape speak without directing what it should say. That quality of attention is one of the things that the conventional archaeological and investigative framework tends to preclude. It comes with an agenda, a research question, a hypothesis to test, a finding to seek. It's not wrong to have those things. They're necessary for rigorous inquiry. But they also, by their nature, filter what can be received. They let in what's relevant to the question and screen out what isn't. The underground spaces of Australia have things to say that don't fit the research questions that have been directed at them. Or rather, the research questions that have been directed at them have been the wrong shape. Too narrow, too oriented toward specific kinds of answers that the existing framework can accommodate. Not open enough to the possibility that what the places are trying to communicate doesn't map onto any existing category. Indigenous Australian ways of knowing have always insisted on this. The knowledge that the land holds, including the knowledge held underground, is not simply data waiting to be extracted by whoever asks the right question. It's knowledge that has its own structure, its own conditions for transmission, its own requirements about the state of mind and the quality of relationship of the person receiving it. You can't just go in with a survey instrument and expect to get the full measure of what's there, not because the physical evidence isn't there, but because the physical evidence is only part of what's there. The meaning of the physical evidence, which is inseparable from its significance, requires a framework for reception that the conventional investigative approach doesn't have. That's not mysticism, it's epistemology. It's a claim about what knowledge is and how it's transmitted and received. And it's a claim that has, in the specific context of very long-term oral traditions, a practical basis. Traditions that have been maintained for 60,000 years have been maintained because the framework for their transmission worked. The fact that the knowledge is still there, still alive in the communities that carry it, across everything that those communities have survived, is evidence that the framework works. That the way the knowledge is structured and transmitted and received is adequate to keeping it intact across enormous spans of time. The investigative framework that came in from outside, that tried to access the underground spaces through surveys and drilling programs and classified assessments, hasn't worked as well. Not because the investigators were less intelligent or less careful, but because they were using a framework that wasn't designed for this material. A framework that was designed to find things that fit into predetermined categories in a landscape where some of the most significant things don't fit those categories. The reconciliation of those two frameworks, the Indigenous framework for knowing the underground and the investigative framework for documenting and analysing it, is one of the most important intellectual projects available to this moment in Australian history. And it's beginning to happen. Not at the pace it should, not with the resources it deserves, but it's beginning. In the conversations between Indigenous scholars and mainstream archaeologists that have been developing over the past 2 decades, in the collaborative research programs, still rare but growing in number, that try to integrate oral tradition and physical evidence in ways that don't subordinate one to the other. In the legal processes around native title that require the law to engage with Indigenous ways of knowing about connection to land. In the community-led heritage documentation projects that are preserving traditional knowledge in forms that can persist if the living transmission is interrupted. All of these are beginnings. All of them are inadequate to the scale of what's needed. All of them are better than nothing, which is what there was before. And they're building toward the moment when the question of what lies underground in Australia can be asked properly, in a framework that can receive the answer in all its dimensions, physical and cultural and historical and cosmological, all at once. That moment isn't here yet, but the work toward it is happening. In the places where the two frameworks are learning to speak to each other, learning the patience and the respect and the quality of attention that the very old knowledge requires before it's willing to be fully known, that's where the next chapter of this story is being written. Not in the tunnels themselves, in the conversations between the people who know the tunnels from inside the tradition and the people who want to understand them from outside it. Conversations that require both parties to come without their usual defenses, without the framework that tells them in advance what the other person can know, just two kinds of knowing, trying to find the language that lets them speak to each other, about the oldest thing, in the oldest place, under the oldest ground. That conversation is the next sealed door, and it's beginning to open. Slowly, as all the best things do, there's something worth saying here about what it means to be a person listening to this story. Not the investigators, not the administrators, not the elders. Just a person, in whatever place and time you find yourself, hearing a story about something that happened a long way away and a long time ago, and that is still, in ways that were never supposed to be visible, unfolding. Hearing a story like this changes the landscape you're in, slightly. It adds a layer. You know now that the ground you're standing on has its own version of this, has its own underground history, its own unsatisfied questions, its own places where human beings once did things that the official record hasn't adequately acknowledged. Every continent on Earth has those places. Every culture has the things that were sealed and the knowledge that was managed and the evidence that was suppressed because its implications were inconvenient. Australia's version is particularly clear because the documented pattern of suppression is particularly consistent, and because the relationship between the underground evidence and the ongoing political and legal processes around Indigenous rights gives the suppression a particular legibility. You can see the shape of the choice that was made and is being remade. You can see who benefits from the managed uncertainty and who pays the price for it. But the pattern, once you see it here, is recognizable elsewhere, in the way that underground sacred sites in other parts of the world have been restricted and restricted and restricted until the restriction becomes the thing the public knows about rather than the site itself. In the way that Indigenous oral traditions in many parts of the world have been classified as mythology when they describe events that subsequent physical investigation has shown to be real. In the way that administrative systems, everywhere and in every era, develop the habit of protecting themselves from the inconvenience of inconvenient truths. This is a story about Australia. But it's also a story about a pattern that extends far beyond Australia. A pattern that belongs to anyone who has ever wondered what the official record is not saying. Who has noticed the gap where the information should be? Who has asked the question that the framework was designed not to answer? You're part of this story. Not as an investigator, not as a custodian, but as a person who heard it. Who knows, now, that the question exists, that the gap is real. That what's underground in the oldest continent is more significant than anyone who benefited from keeping it sealed has ever been willing to say out loud. That knowledge, even held loosely, even without the specific details, even in the form of the outline rather than the content, is something. It's more than the person who hears this story had before they heard it. And that more, multiplied across all the people who will hear it, is the beginning of the pressure that eventually makes the sealed things open. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, in the way that water finds the crack. You heard the story. The story is now in you. That's not nothing. That's the beginning of the next thing. Whatever comes next in this long unfolding, you're part of the knowing of it now. And knowing is never wasted. Even when what's known is the outline of something whose full content is still sealed. Even then, especially then, the shape of the unknown is the map of where to look. And now you have it. Use it well, or just let it rest in you. In the particular quality of knowing that comes from understanding that there's more to know. That's enough. For now, that's more than enough. In the end, every sealed thing has a version of the same story. Something was put away, decided to be too significant, or too inconvenient, or too sacred to exist in the open. And the putting away was done carefully, with intent, by people who had their reasons and believed those reasons were good enough. And sometimes the sealing did hold, for a generation, for a century, for longer than anyone who did the sealing expected. But the holding was never permanent, because nothing sealed against knowledge stays sealed forever against knowledge. The water finds the crack, the ground subsides at the wrong moment. The person who was told to keep the secret decides that keeping it is costing more than telling it. The document that was supposed to stay buried surfaces in a Freedom of Information request because someone forgot to reclassify it properly. The elder, who was the last living holder of a specific piece of knowledge, decides, in the last years of her life, that the knowledge should go with her would be the greater loss. These are the ways that sealed things open. Not with fanfare, not with dramatic revelation, with the ordinary pressure of time and change and the irresistible human desire on both sides of every sealed door to finally say what's true. The tunnels of Australia have been sealed for a long time. The administrative seal around knowledge of them has been maintained for nearly 200 years. That's a long time for a seal to hold. Long enough that the people who first put it in place are long gone, and the reasons they had for it have been replaced by other reasons, newer reasons, reasons appropriate to a different era that has inherited the seal without having chosen it. The seal is maintained by habit and procedure, and habit, however strong, is not stronger than the accumulated pressure of evidence and time. The seal is weakening, not broken, not yet. What's behind it remains patient, as old stone is patient. Good night. Wherever you are, the ground under you has its own stories, some older than you can imagine, all of them waiting to be heard.